Welcome to today's Wake Up with Sorabh and other more important human beings than myself. Thank you so much to everybody who is here. I will say my standard good mornings to everybody in the world. Um, just want to, before I begin, thank a lot of people who I know most of you are still hungover from that 10 comedians insanity which happened on Tuesday. Don't get used to it. हर बार ऐसा नहीं होने वाला है. It'll happen sometimes. The idea of this podcast is to keep things as free flowing and chilled as possible. So hi to Soham Dikshit. Hello to everybody. I'll just tell you a couple of things. What's happening over the next week? On Saturday, we have a very nice lineup of three comedians who I really like. Kunal Kamra, Karunesh Talwar, and Anubhav Pal are going to be here on Saturday. Sunday, I'm still figuring out the lineup. On Tuesday, we have XNG, which is Varun Thakur, Neville Shah, Adar Malik, and Kautak Srivastav. So yeah, this is going to be a fun Saturday. Sunday will, I think, most likely be. I'll tell you once I've locked it down. Just want to thank a bunch of people who donated on Instamojo. Ankit Agrahari, Parth Chatterjee, Gurpreet Singh, Ramanathan, Ritwij Maunus. There's a long list, man. You guys were really impressed by the 10 comedian wala thing. Now I feel like there's no way we can achieve that success again. This is the worst way to start the opening of the podcast. This is going to be a great one, guys. Ritwij Monas, Ronak Zishan Khan, Saksham Chabra, sorry, Shreya Tripathi, Pratik Kamdar, Tuhina Jain, Rohit Tashwa Nagam, great name. Amol Magar, Sridhar Rangaswamy, Lalit Karan Ajmani. यार इतनी लिस्ट अभी तक पूरी एक पॉडकास्ट की वजह से हुई है. This is the list that I've had for like throughout. Okay. Shashidhar, Mami, Dipeli, Karan Ajmani, Lalit, Tarun, Rahul Venkat, Archit Gupta, Rachit, Anurag, Akhil Pisharodi, Rachit, Anil Damodaran, and Vaishali Thakkar. Thanks a lot to you guys. Really appreciate it. On PayPal, Navjinder Kentharai, Ashish Srivastav, also Ashish Srivastav, one more Ashish Srivastav, and a fourth Ashish Srivastav. Ashish, I don't know if you've made the payment 4 times or whether you just gave it out of love. But if you did, let me know. I will help you. Prathamesh, Rajiv Khandalkar, Neeraj Subedar, Nitin Kulkarni, and Atul Ravani. Thanks a lot, guys. Really appreciate it. Again, the PayPal and stuff is just to keep this thing running. Hi to everybody. As I said, Soham Chakravarti, when are you bringing Neville Varun? Is on Tuesday. Saturday again, as I said, is Kunal Kamra, Karunesh Talwar, and Anubhav Pal. All three fantastic comedians. And yeah. Hey Saurabh, how's Vir Sanghvi gonna live up to the last stream? We're gonna see, guys. He is. He's a very. You guys genuinely gonna watch his old interviews. Both Kumar and me are massive fans of him. Okay, last thing before I start is I have a bunch of shows coming up, which is 31st. I have a show which is for the Middle East, which is happening with Oman is Laughing. I think you can go to saurabhpant.com for tickets. First, I have a show as well as a workshop that I'm doing about writing, which is called How to Write That Book, which is happening as part of the Coalition Festival. On first, I also have a stand-up show in the evening. Second, I also have a stand-up show. So there's a bunch of things happening. Go to saurabhpant.com. All right, that is all I have to say in life. There is nothing more left to say. I have promoted everything. Also, love me. Cool. That's about it, guys. Now I'm very excited about today's stream. I've been a fan of this gentleman for a genuinely long time. And yeah, so without further ado, I want to bring on Mr. Vir Sanghvi and of course accompanying me, Mr. Kumar Varun. Please join us, gentlemen. Please. Sir, you'll have to
Yes.
start your video, Mr. Sanghvi. KV, how are you doing, KV?
Another sleepless night because of you, Sorabh. That's all I want to say. Did not sleep. Could not sleep.
You know, I always love that you have this bookshelf at the back just to show that that
No,
hey.
so I will talk about it when he comes with the capital H.
Hello, sir. How are you doing? Hi.
Hello, hi.
Hello, sir.
This is Kumar Varun. If you're not
Hi,
familiar with
Hey,
him,
Kumar,
Kumar
how are
Varun,
you?
he's a
I'm
stand-up
good, sir.
comedian. He's also a
I
great
know
friend
he
of
is. I
mine.
know
Yeah,
he is. Yeah.
awesome. Again, great background full of books. This is like again my shitty background of this cupboard and all that stuff. It really needs to change. So yeah, how's the lockdown be for you, sir? How's everything happening in the lockdown so far?
Very boring here. Don't do very much. Sit at home and write all day, and occasionally do a Zoom show for TV. That's about it. It's been 4 months now, and it's beginning to get to me.
It's slowly catching up, right? It's
Yeah.
uh, I was trying to figure this out, and I realized that the lockdown is essentially having good days and bad hours, where you just have to
True.
deal with 2 hours where you're just like, this is the worst thing ever, and then you just live with it. Okay, I just want to tell you, I was rewatching a lot of your old interviews, and the reason,
Okay.
in fact, no, but listen, that Amitabh Bachchan interview, and also the one with Mr. Wadia. Both those two interviews were just like legendary in both the respective scenes. We'll come to it shortly.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, because I think there's a lot to talk about. For those of you who've never seen the show before, the way it works is that we'll just be talking to the guest, and then I'll take some questions from the chat. If you put it on super chat, that'll be much easier. Madhav Pangarkar has already started. Thanks a lot, man. Appreciate it. So yeah, let's begin. Um, Kumar, you want to say your highs and get that out of the way?
Yes, I want to get my fandom out of the way before I become normal and start talking like an educated adult. Okay, I want to make 3 quick points, and this might be very awkward for Veer sir, but I can't help it. Okay, the first story is back when I was in 8th standard. Okay, and like a normal Indian middle class family, one of the things that happened, Saurabh, tell me if you went through it, is when the parents, like in my case, my grandfather was like, now you need to start reading English newspaper. Okay, this is back in 7th 8th standard, where he was like, you should read because it will improve your English. So I was like, okay, let's do it. This is back in 1998. Okay, and then he got me all the English newspapers available in Delhi. So I had like Indian Express, Times of India, Hindustan Times, The Hindu, the usual jazz. And I'm not exaggerating, that is the first day I read a column called Counterpoint. Okay, and I can show it in the other room. I have not stopped reading Hindustan Times for the last 22 years. Okay, because of that one column I read. I think it was, if I'm not wrong, something about the Gujarat government or Vajpayee government, something about Pokhran, whatever was happening in '98. And I was like, what is this? Okay, and till then, till now, that is my first, like the first moment.
This is
Okay,
just the first part. This is the
this
first
is
part of
just
it.
the first part. I have
Can
just
I
two
just
small.
interrupt to say you already made my day? So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, sir.
You know what? I got to say this, that KV is a fan of people, and like he's always skeptical about expressing it. And I'm like, no, I think that's what, like, who doesn't like to hear that? Hey, people love
Absolutely.
what you do.
Yeah, because like when you write a column, you're writing into the void, no? Two
Yeah.
million people may read it, but you don't meet them. Now with social media, it's a little easier. But around that period, you wrote the column, it went out, people read it, but you had no fucking clue whether they liked it, didn't like it. So it's always a relief to hear this.
Wow.
But back then, did you? I mean, just take a side note. The only
Yeah.
way you could get feedback was letters to the editor or people physically sending you a letter. That was actually the only two ways, right?
Yeah, but also, I mean, have you ever written a letter to the editor? Generally, most decent people never wrote letters to the editor. So the letters
Yeah.
to the editor you got were from very chamcha-like people, people with an axe to grind, people who were really pushy and wanted to see their name in print, people who wanted to abuse you. So it wasn't really great feedback. Social media is slightly better, but again, it's people with an axe to grind, people who want to abuse you. So the only way you can really know is if you meet people like you, for instance, who actually read it and tell you. And that's an incredibly gratifying feeling. Thank you.
But Kumar, now the part two, the
Yeah.
sequel to your
Part two.
opening.
Yes. Part two. Anyone in the lockdown who has been like Saurabh, you know that I keep doing like Zoom stream, YouTube stream, quizzes, etc. for the past few months, and this
Yeah.
has been my frame all this while. So whatever I'm saying right now is not customized for this live stream. Is what I want to say. Anyone can go back 3 months back and see the frame. It was still the same. So out here in this frame, I keep all my like favorite authors right here. Okay. If you see, there's Amitabh Ghosh, there's Tarun, there's Nepal, there's Gabriel Garcia Marquez, there's George Orwell. In middle of all this, I have this tiny book there, which is this.
Wow.
Which is,
Thank
which
you.
is this.
Makes my day again.
Which is this. With there's Amartya Sen, there is
Yeah.
Upmanyu Chatterjee and Vikas Swaroop and
I was a
everyone,
bit
but
short
there's
sip
this.
on intellectual midget, but thank you.
No. You're just being very humble. I want to make the last point before it gets like more awkward.
Yeah.
Uh, now, as we know, most of us have moved to Kindle. And again, not exaggerating because I have WhatsApp group proof for this when someone asks, "What are you reading nowadays?" And this is what I'm reading on Kindle nowadays. It's called The Indian Pantry by Vir Sanghvi, which is the best of root food.
This just
So
gets better
that's
and better. Thank you so much.
yes, that's it. I don't wanna make
The
Veer sir
only
more
way this
awkward.
can go forward is Kumar Varun turning, and by the way, the last thing, and then it's just a dedicated portrait that you've made out of your own blood of Vir Sanghvi on the right side.
At the moment, I can't keep the smile off my face. So thank you.
Thank you.
but
It's been an honor.
but I think it's true. You've been involved in journalism for decades now, and been one of the most pivotal people in Indian journalism for literally it's been 3-4 decades. How many?
Okay. My first article appeared in 1976, which is before most of your parents were born. So it's been a long time.
Before I was born, my parents didn't start that young also.
Okay.
I was 1980, so 1976. So where did you, for whom did you write that particular piece?
It was like a strange thing because I finished school in Ajmer, and in those days, it's probably still true. If you wanted to go to university in England, you had to go and do you had to go 2 more years of something called A levels. So I went to London, I did the A levels, I took the exam to enter university. And again, in those days, you took the exam in December, but the term began in October. So you had to basically fart around, what English people call their gap year during that period. So I came back to Bombay and I really didn't have much to do. Some people I knew were starting a magazine called India Today. It was the emergency. It was a bad period for journalism. They didn't know anybody. They were Delhi based. So I was around. I was cheap. I wasn't asking for any money. So they asked me to write for them. So in 76, I began writing for India Today pretty much as a school leaver between school and university. And that's how I got into this business.
So do you remember what the first piece was about?
Oh, Christ, I'm trying to remember. Yeah, I do actually. It was an interview with a man called Conrad Rooks, who nobody now remembers, but who had just made a movie called Siddhartha, it was an English movie, starring Shashi Kapoor and Simi Grewal. It gained a certain notoriety because Simi Grewal did a topless scene, which in those days was considered really incredible, unusual shock horror. And I interviewed him about the film and about the state of Hollywood. That was the first ever piece I did.
I mean, but that's like my question is, how did you get access to Conrad? I mean, to like your first piece is straight a Hollywood director. That's pretty high
Yeah,
end.
but it was, I keep saying this to people. It wasn't difficult in those days. Those days, you wanted to interview a star. You turned up on the sets, any movie star, with the possible exception of Amitabh Bachchan, who had a huge protocol. But you turned up on the sets, the star was there. Between shots, they'd give you an interview. It wasn't like now when you have to go through 6 layers of PR machinery. The star will only talk if there's a movie to promote. You could just wander and ask anybody what they wanted. It was pretty much the same with politicians. When I was 22, I was interviewing chief ministers of Maharashtra. It really wasn't a big deal. The world was a very different place. People were much more accessible. Possibly they were nicer. And this whole great PR machine hadn't been established.
I mean, it's interesting that you bring up the Amitabh Bachchan interview. I think that
Yeah.
the cover story interview. I rewatched it yesterday again after many years, and it's I think there is so much of subcontext to the interview itself, which is your relationship with Mr. Bachchan at some stage. Because you start off the interview by saying the last time you didn't speak at all and you rarely speak, and I'm like, any other interviewer saying that, Bachchan would be like, hey, but you saying that he was totally chilled about it. And I'm like, that's very interesting. So, how much do you think the baggage of the not the baggage actually the almost the gift of the relationship, like, and including the one with Nusli Wadia, how much of the relationship prior to the interview carries forward in the interview?
Yeah, it's obviously a blessing because you know what the guy is like. But it's also a burden because if you know the guy well, he gets really pissed off if you ask rude questions. So you have to find some kind of balance that allows you to get the best out of him without being offensive. In the case of Amitabh Bachchan, because you mentioned it, there are essentially two Amitabh Bachchans. There's the guy who turns up on camera, who answers monosyllabically, looks sort of pissed off most of the time and wanders off. And then there's the Amitabh Bachchan who talks and gives of himself. It's very difficult when you do an interview because you don't know which Bachchan is going to show up. So I always ask when he turns up, "Ye kaun aaya yaar? Are you the monosyllabic guy or are you the talkative guy?" Fortunately, once I've got the kind of guy, but most times I've been lucky and I've got the guy who talks.
So, I mean, I'll come to cover story in a bit. I'm very curious to know about your entire journey, because it's so interesting that you started effectively just at the almost the end of the emergency, roughly, as a journalist, and that must have been a weird time, because I was oddly enough finally reading Darbar by Tavleen Singh,
Yeah.
and the fact that you couldn't talk anything politics, and there was one of the few tidbits that I got was that restaurants had signs saying that you can't talk politics inside this restaurant,
Yeah.
which is crazy. That's absolutely unreal. So, okay, you started writing for the India Today, and then what happened next? How did this whole
Then I went off to university in England, and they had a really cool system, which was they had 3 terms, each of 8 weeks, which ended up as 6 months. So you had the other 6 months free to do what you wanted. So I would come back to India every holiday on a cheap ticket, and I would continue writing for India Today. So in 1978, when I was still at university, they said they wanted to start a new magazine called Bombay, and would I edit it? So I said, sure. So I started working on Bombay, and in 79, when I finished, I got my degree and I came back. I came back, I think, in July, and in August, we launched the first issue of Bombay. So my career was really part student and part journalist for all of those years.
Okay, somebody just asked a question. I mean, this is a good
Yeah.
question to start with. 1 second, where's it gone? Shruti asked if someone is getting introduced to Vir Sanghvi's writing, what is the book he recommends they start from?
A book generally or a book I've written?
A book of yours, just to get introduced.
Mandate.
Yeah, Mandate would be it.
Because it gives you a pretty good idea of what happened during the years. Actually, it starts from 69, 71. So even before I was an active journalist, it's an easy, simple read. It's based on a television series I did. It won't take you long. People read it on, say, one plane journey. Bombay, Delhi, you probably finish the book. It's the easiest one to read, and I think most people would find it interesting.
Okay, there's a question which is coming from, okay, people have already started asking questions, so let's just jump right into it. Neela Pathak asks, can a newspaper be left or right leaning? I think most newspapers are something, right? It's not.
Yeah, abroad they are. For instance, the Telegraph, the Daily Telegraph in London is considered right-leaning. The Guardian also in England is considered left-leaning. In India, I don't know. I think we don't really care about left or right or about ideology or political principles. It's sort of pro-BJP, pro-Congress. It ends up being that sort of thing. Or like the Hindustan Times, which traditionally was pro-establishment. The Times of India also pro-establishment. It doesn't matter who is in the establishment. In India, we have very little sense of ideology in politics, and very little, unfortunately, also in journalism. Everything is about political parties, politics, not about ideas, not about principles, which is sad.
It's very interesting about the pro-establishment thing, because I think my mom had a theory, which is that you can notice who's going to win the elections basis how quickly the leading newspapers sort of change their reportage, where it's like first it starts off with blah blah blah, and then it's suddenly slowly a shift happening. So you're like, okay, maybe there is some communication happening. KV, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I have many. I'm thinking which one to start from. I'm thinking which one to start from. I'll start with something really basic doubt that I had, because there's a lot of chatter on social media and internet overall about how journalism in the country has changed, and how it's very cacophonous now, etc., etc., etc. But I'm not going into the detail of that. There's also a lot of nostalgia about the good old days of Doordarshan. I see a lot of people sharing like small clips saying, "Oh, it used to be so nice, and now it's so like whatever." But like one way to look at it is also the fact that then also, I mean, Doordarshan, etc., were also essentially government mouthpiece at some level. Okay, so it's not that they didn't have propaganda, it's just that there was less noise, there was
Yeah,
less opinion, and they
exactly.
were just reporting what the government was saying. How do you compare these two eras, so to speak, of post-cable 24/7 newspaper news channels and the good old days of just Doordarshan or maybe NDTV?
Actually,
Because
there are
you've
like
been sorry,
three.
because you've been apart, we right
Yeah.
of both
Okay.
these.
So there are three phases. The first is the Doordarshan phase, and I cannot for the life of me understand the nostalgia for Doordarshan, which was essentially a government propaganda machine. All that happened was the people who read the news had no involvement in creating it or doing anything. They were essentially announcers. The government wrote the script and they read it out. Yes, they didn't shout and they were better behaved than some of today's actors, but
Yeah.
that's not a good enough reason to feel
Yeah.
nostalgic. You
Yes.
then have a phase when people try and model themselves on CNN, on BBC, the early years of Star News, which became NDTV, CNN News 18. They tried very hard, it was called, I think, CNN IBN in those days. They tried very hard to become proper international standard news channels. And you have now the current situation where the news channels really don't give a fuck about the news. They're not like American news channels or British news channels even. They model themselves on American talk radio. American talk radio, as you know, is guys shouting at each other, people being aggressive, people being assertive, people taking very extremist opinions. You do an experiment if you have a sort of color or a brightness control on your television set. When the news is on at 9 o'clock, turn the screen to black and just listen to what people are saying. You will lose nothing because they never have any footage. They never report any stories. There's never any visual element. It's just guys shouting at each other. Essentially, it's radio. So I find it very hard to get excited about today's television, which doesn't even send out reporters, doesn't even report stories, just wants strong opinions, strongly expressed. And the anchor, who should be like the referee, is essentially like the crooked referee in a WWF wrestling match who comes in on one side and then trips the guy when he's not looking. So essentially, they're all fixed matches based entirely on talk, 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 and no news at all. So I can understand why people are not nostalgic about this kind of news. But remember that you and I will get angry about, say, a certain anchor or whatever. But of the entire television universe in India, English news is 0.1%. Not even 1%, 0.1%. In a good time when there's lots of exciting stuff happening, maybe 0.2%. So it really doesn't matter. It's just a few guys entertaining themselves in a bubble.
But you don't think? I mean, I tend to disagree with that because don't you think that the almost the format of that screaming, shouting, going ballistic has sort of permeated into social media, and they've both sort of become one, almost one unit of people just being angry at each other. Like, even okay, I'll read out some of the comments, and I'm happy to read out questions to you because I
Yeah.
know that you are upfront and you can pretty much take any of these.
Okay.
Some questions have already started. I think the trolling always begins.
All right.
But I think it's almost become like the drawing room conversations that we used to have, which were relaxed, have become almost close to psychotic because of both news and social media. Is that fair, or you don't think?
I think all of us are schizophrenic. Like I'm sitting here chatting to you, and we're being reasonably civil. Even
Yeah,
if I get one of those anchors on news channels who shouts and raves and rants, we get him on your show. He or she will be civil and reasonable. But
yeah,
something happens to us when we're put in one of these television shows, which are so-called debate programs. Something happens to us when we're on Twitter. We get more aggressive. We get more abusive. The less attractive side of all human beings seems to come out on that kind of social media. And news television, and if you look back and you try and date it, the change in news television happens after Twitter. I think in many ways, news television is modeling itself on the aggression and the rubbish that you find in so much social media. It's not the other way around. And just as social media, everybody can be a troll if the circumstances are right. On this kind of news television, everybody is a troll.
I just want to add one point, Saurabh.
Mhm.
Just taking from what Veer sir said about English channel being 0.1% to 0.2%, even Twitter for that matter, and whatever, however big deal Twitter is in our minds, it's still barely a few percent of Indian vote
Exactly.
Yeah,
bank or Indian population. It's a huge thing in our head, but I don't know the percentage, but I presume it's minuscule compared to what the vote bank
It
or the
doesn't even
mandate of.
show up on a Raj. In
Yeah.
fact, when Modi won the election the last time around, when he had his version of the government the first term, I spoke to the guys who'd organized his campaign, and it's no secret that they have all these troll farms and IT cells and people who set out to abuse and intimidate people. And I spoke to one of the guys who ran that part of his campaign, and he said, "You guys can complain all you want about Twitter, but Twitter doesn't matter to us. The stuff that matters to us is Facebook." And what they did during Modi's election was they set up on WhatsApp and Facebook little groups, many of them in Indian elections, in Indian languages. And they believed that that swung the election much more than anything we would see on Twitter. They said that Twitter is basically a small proportion of the English speaking elite calling each other names. Enjoy yourselves, but you're of no consequence, which I think is
Fair.
right.
Yeah, sounds fair enough. Okay, we got a question from Chinmay Kulkarni who asks, Veer, sir, huge fan. Thank you, sir, for getting him on your podcast. No, thank you for him to coming. That's the sentence. You've
Thank you.
interviewed a lot of people. Which is the most seamless interview in terms of conversation, and which is the most difficult one? I'm assuming that this has been a question that you've answered before
Yeah.
as well. Yeah.
It's been asked before, but I've never had an answer. The honest answer is there are many good interviews and there are some bad interviews, but fortunately, the good interviews outweigh the bad interviews. Sometimes, when you're interviewing somebody who's like a big deal at the time, say Tony Blair when he's Prime Minister of the UK or whatever, you're slightly more intimidated, therefore, probably not at your best. When you're interviewing someone like, to take your parallel, Amitabh Bachchan, who I do know reasonably well, I'm easier. So I don't know if there is any one interview that I remember as being spectacular or good. I remember when Rajiv Gandhi was Prime Minister, we interviewed him and he said many, many indiscreet things and it made a lot of news. So in many ways, that was a good interview. But how do you judge good? Do you judge it by the way I enjoy it? Do you judge it by how much news it makes? Do you judge it by TRPs? I've really stopped judging it. It's like my articles. I don't have a favorite article. I just do my shit here, and then people like it or they don't like it.
My sister was a business journalist for the longest time, and she was
Yeah,
working in
I
New
know
York.
your sisters. Yeah,
Yeah, so Meghna is my sister. I mean, yeah, of course you guys know. And so she was telling me a story like she interviewed in I think a span of about 3 months. She interviewed Hillary Rodham Clinton. She
wow.
interviewed Chidambaram, and then she interviewed some I think some massive business tycoon in the U.S. And she's like, yeah, it was great, it's fun. And then she got intimidated interviewing Vivek Oberoi. And she's like, I don't know what it was. She's like, I
Yeah.
just entered the interview and somehow I didn't expect him to be so tall or something like that. I was like, that's the weirdest thing. So I don't know if that's ever happened.
So it's exactly like that. She's spot on because everybody is so different when you interview them.
Yeah,
Like Chidambaram, for instance, you
yeah,
mentioned him. When you interview him for television, he still acts like he's talking to a stenographer. In that every question is answered at dictation speed, like you're writing it down and you have to make sure. He's not like that off camera. So people change when they're on camera.
yeah. KV, you had something? Yeah.
Yes, I wanted to, and basically when we were talking to Ramchandra Guha on this very series, I told him that one of the things that fascinate me about history is what ifs or like hypotheticals.
Yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to start ask a hypothetical question. You're free to not answer it. I know, like basis your reading, that you were very close friends with Madhavrao Sindhya,
I
and
was,
you
yeah.
wrote a book about him, and you were very close. What if, and you can say no to it. What if Madhavrao Sindhya were still here? How do you see Indian politics in general or Indian National Congress in particular to be different than what it is? It's just a
I
hypothetical
think there's a
question.
good chance he would have been prime minister. A very good chance. And if he was, because given that Sonia Gandhi didn't want the job, and if he was prime minister, he would not have been like Manmohan Singh, who was like a quiet sort of guy, didn't do very much, and sleepwalked through the last 3 years of his term. Madhavrao Sindhya would have been much more active, would have done things. But I have a different what if along the same way. Manmohan Singh becomes prime minister in UPA 1, right?
Yeah.
UPA 2, he's now alienated the left. And it looks like the UPA will get the same number of seats or less than before. If that happens, the left will not support Manmohan Singh. So internally, the Congress was ready for that to happen. And Pranab Mukherjee was tipped to take over. If Pranab Mukherjee had become Prime Minister in UPA 2, would the scams have happened? Would he have been as quiet and as sleepwalking a Prime Minister as Manmohan Singh? Or let's take another scenario, which is that Manmohan Singh and Sonia Gandhi had lost that election and Advani had become Prime Minister, which was a distinct possibility. If Advani had become Prime Minister and you'd had a BJP government, would Narendra Modi ever have happened? Would you ever have had a Modi government? Wouldn't the BJP have been a very different party? Wouldn't the history of India have changed? So, like you, I'm as fascinated by the what
Yeah,
ifs.
yeah, yeah.
I have a weird question, which is I've read it in a bunch of books, and I don't think anybody's been able to sort of like say whether it's true or no. Is about the Pranab Mukherjee thing with the Gandhi family. Is
Yeah,
that apparently the story goes that he was on the plane after Gandhi was
it's a true
assassinated.
story.
It's
He
a true
told it to
story.
me.
Yeah.
He told it to me. If you want, I'll tell you the story.
Yeah, I'd love to hear the story.
It's been fun. Mrs. Gandhi was killed, or was shot certainly,
Yeah.
when Rajiv Gandhi was in Bengal. He was addressing some rallies. He was told his mother had been shot, and a special plane was arranged to take him back to Delhi. Pranab Mukherjee was also in Calcutta. He was on that plane. My source for this is Pranab Mukherjee, so presumably it's a reliable story. And they were all very tense. They didn't know what was going to happen. And when they were nearing Delhi, Rajiv Gandhi went into the cockpit and then he came out and he looked fairly emotional. And he said, "I'm sorry, we've lost her. She's dead." And everybody reacted on that plane with complete shock, except Pranab Mukherjee, who, according to his own words, loudly burst into tears and began crying. But he didn't cry that often because then he went into the cockpit and he sent a message to Delhi, which is that he wanted the cabinet secretary, the home secretary, and the three service chiefs to be at the airport to receive the plane so he could give them instructions. So he was not prime minister because there was no prime minister. Prime minister was dead. He was technically number two in Mrs. Gandhi's cabinet. So therefore, he felt he had to take charge. Rajiv Gandhi and Arun Nehru felt he was staging some kind of coup and trying to become a prime minister, an interim prime minister at the very least, which is why I think that evening itself, they swore Rajiv Gandhi in. They never quite forgave him. They threw him out of the government. They didn't make him a finance minister or anything. He was sent back to West Bengal and asked to do municipal politics, which I mean, he can't do politics. He's not the kind of guy who wins elections. So he completely screwed up the municipal elections. They lost very badly. And this comes from Pranab Mukherjee. Late that night, Arun Nehru, in those days, was a very powerful man, called him, shouted at him, and said, "You go and bloody resign now." So this poor man had no alternative but to resign from his job as Bengal Congress chief. He then stuck in the wilderness. He tried launching a political party that was utter and complete disaster. Somehow, towards the end of Rajiv's term, he went and met Rajiv, apologized, explained his situation, and then he was in with the Gandhis. Had Rajiv Gandhi lived and had Narasimha Rao not become prime minister after the assassination, Pranab Mukherjee would have been finance minister right then. So it was pretty much a sort of turning up and down kind of life he's led. Was that the question you were going to ask me?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I obviously messed up the assassination. It was obviously Indira Gandhi. But here's my question. Do you think that he was actually, I mean, again, this is, I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do you think that was he just trying to make sure that things were efficiently handled, or do you think he was actually at that moment? And it's so weird how small moments like this
Yeah.
define your entire career. Like, do you think he was actually vying for the post, or was he just trying to make sure that things were efficiently handled?
A little of both. Though, to be fair to him, I think his main motive was to see that things were efficiently handled. But if they told him you can have the post and wait till Rajiv, who at that stage had no ministerial experience, is ready, I think he'd have grabbed it with both hands.
Yeah. I have a very weird question, and I think one of the things you mentioned in the Musli Wale interview, which I was like, huh, was
Uh,
that you said I just spoke to Rajiv Gandhi, and I was like, what? Like, because like it's unfathomable right now to be a journalist, and this is not specific to any party, to be a journalist and be close to anybody who's running. Like, I think that's almost changed completely. The dynamics have.
yeah.
I don't know if that's true or no, but there are very few journalists who are, because I think they've figured out, politicians have figured out their own line of communication without having to rely on journalists, if that makes any sense. But yeah, I'm just curious to know that what is the relationship with Rajiv Gandhi like? And you
No,
mentioned multiple times about him, so I'm just curious about it.
I actually didn't know Rajiv Gandhi when he was Prime Minister very well. I met him for the first time in February 1987, and we talked. He was then having, it's a long forgotten political battle, but he was fighting with the President of India in those days, Yani Zail Singh. So I met him. He gave me a briefing about what his version was. I went and saw Zail Singh, who gave me his version, and it was hard to tell who was telling the truth. So I ran both versions. You couldn't quote the president, of course. Rajiv was off the record, so it was attributed to friends of Rajiv Gandhi. But it was quite clear to anybody who read the article where it was coming from. I then didn't meet him again till we went to do an interview with him, I think in 1989. I mean, it's an odd thing because, again, you guys won't remember. In those days, Rajiv had an aide called Satish Sharma.
Yes,
He
Captain
was like
Satish
an
Sharma.
incredibly powerful guy. And there was a huge scandal because Satish Sharma had imported marble tiles for his swimming pool and customs had
Oh,
stopped it and it had been cleared. So I asked him about that and he said, well, he says the marble tiles were a gift from a friend or for his father-in-law, so it was all right, etc. So I said to Rajiv, I said, okay, I accept all that. Remember, we are now talking about 89. This guy is an Indian Airlines pilot. Satish Sharma. He's been a pilot all his life. I said, how many of us have swimming pools at home? And on a pilot salary, this guy has a huge farmhouse in Mehrauli on the outskirts of Delhi and a bloody great swimming pool. Isn't that strike you as being odd? And the thing about Rajiv Gandhi was that he answered every question. You could ask him anything. And even when it was sensible for him to change the subject, he would plunge in regardless. And he said, no, all Indian Airlines pilots are swimming pools, which was demonstrably untrue. And the whole interview became quite a scandal. And then, much to my horror, when he was out of power in 1990, he gave me another interview. And in that, he spoke quite honestly. I think the headline was, yes, I made many mistakes. I was young. So it was unusual for an Indian politician to say, look, guys, I'm sorry I screwed up. So I met him a few times after that. And then before he could come to power, I think sadly, he was assassinated. But the point was, you could go to the prime minister, you could argue with him about swimming pools or whatever, and he would banter with you. It isn't a situation that happened with some later prime ministers who I'll not mention, who, if you dared say something like that, two men would come, hustle you out, and they'd shoot you in the lawns. It wasn't that at all. It was much easier to talk in those days.
yes, KV.
I had a, yeah, I had a related question, and that's why I wanted to ask. Uh, a lot of assessment of Rajiv Gandhi, the oft used adjective for his prime ministership and him is the word naive. A lot of people, whenever they talk about 84 to 89, they talk about how he had the biggest majority till date, biggest mandate till date in Indian Parliament. But then people quote about the Shah Bano case, about the Ramlala opening, and then the disastrous IPKF, the fateful thing that happened in
Yeah.
Sri Lanka. How do you, I mean, we also understand that he had zero political experience. Like you said, he was an airline pilot. Thrust upon him. The greatness was thrust upon him, so to speak. Uh, do you, in your assessment, because you obviously were a part of that era and you were much closer to him than all of us combined, uh, how do you assess Rajiv Gandhi, the prime minister, and his
So
term? Do you think it was naive, or do you think, I mean, your assessment of
I
those
think it
5 years?
was naivety and inexperience. He was probably the nicest man ever to become Prime Minister of India. He radiated warmth. Nowadays, when you meet politicians, it's very clear you're like an insect and they're a giant dinosaur. With Rajiv, he treated almost everybody he met on equal terms. He would listen to you, he would banter with you. And he had this capacity that if he met you for 5 minutes, he squeezed so much warmth into that meeting that you felt you'd met him for half an hour or you knew him much better than you really did. That was the good side. The other good side was that he had, I thought, the right instincts. He had the right instincts in the way that most middle class people had those instincts. Yeah, there's too much bloody government involvement. We've got to reduce the power of these dhotiwalas. We've got to clean up the system. So it was all at that level. When it came to the nitty gritty, trying to work out how politics work, even though he'd helped his mother for 3 years, he never really understood how it happened. He allowed himself to be guided by a succession of advisors, for want of a better term, most of whom, in retrospect, were pretty useless. And I don't think he had the confidence ever to tell them that you're wrong, that you shouldn't do this. IPKF, I think, was a mistake, but it started with the best intentions. The idea was to impose peace on Sri Lanka and make our neighbors as peaceful as we wanted them to, which was, in essence, a good idea, but they screwed it up in the implementation. The Shah Banu thing, I thought, was a huge, huge mistake on his part. He first took a normal liberal thing, saying that, of course, a Muslim woman should get maintenance, and was then besieged by people saying, you have insulted the Muslim community, you must turn this around. So he said, okay, if that's what Muslims want, I'll turn it around, which I think was a mistake. If you've made a decision and you've made it on the basis of principles that you believe in, you stick with it. You don't turn it around because there's political pressure. In the case of the Babri Masjid, it's slightly more complicated. People forget, we remember this 1984 mandate. We forget that that was in many ways the first Hindutva election. Though we don't see it in those terms, we just had the Punjab agitation, and now we romanticize the Punjab agitation. But there's no doubt during the Punjab militancy, Hindus were targeted. Many Hindus were massacred. They would stop buses, they would separate Hindus and others and shoot the Hindus. There was a lot of Hindu anger in those days. And that anger had sharpened after assassinations and all of that. So a lot of Hindus voted for the Congress. There were many people in the Congress who believed that, particularly the people around Rajiv Gandhi, that the Congress could then become the party of Hindus. And once you weaponize the majority community, you were undefeatable, because say Muslims voted against you with 12 to 15%. How did it matter? You had 84% of the vote. So this kind of view was Arun Nehru and various advisors to Rajiv Gandhi had this view. I suspect the Ram Lalla opening, the taking the genie out of the bottle, was part of that strategy. But I don't think that was Rajiv really. I don't think he was particularly. In fact, he was asked by the Sunday Times of London, do you believe in God? And everybody sort of gives vague answers about the cosmic spirit or whatever. And he said, no, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God. So he was not a religious person in any way. But I think he was manipulated into believing this was the way forward. He was not strong enough to resist. And then he was caught in a maelstrom that ultimately took him down. This is not by way of excuse. He should never have said yes to those people. But you're right. I think he was inexperienced, and I think he was naive.
Wow. Okay, now is when this somebody now. This is the question which is been hanging here, which is okay. This is based on The Accidental Prime Minister by Sanjay Baru, which is. I'm curious what you think about this book, because I genuinely really
enjoyed
it.
I read it. It's like one good fiction bestseller. You can read it a couple of sittings. It's enjoyable. It's a page turner.
But a lot of truths, or is it because
a lot of stuff is between Sanjay and Manmohan Singh, and there was nobody else in the room, so we don't know. Manmohan Singh has said all of it is untrue. Sanjay said it's true. So it ultimately comes down to who you believe.
Right. Okay, so this is a question, and this is when we get into controversial territory. And I'm going to read this question.
Bring it on.
Verbatim. Indranil Gokhale asks, why is Vir Sanghvi such a Sonia Reid Gandhi family sellout? P.S. He pre-screened Hindustan Times questions for Sonia and insulted PM Singh. Source Baru's book.
You know what this is about? This is about when the nuclear deal was happening, and you guys will remember that. The Indo-US nuclear deal, which Manmohan Singh was desperately committed to. And he said when the deal goes through, billions of dollars of investment will flow, India will become a super rich country, etc. All of which was bullshit, as we've now seen. Sonia had opposed the deal on the grounds that the left had said they would withdraw support if the deal went through. She said it may be a good deal, but it's not worth losing the government over. At the Hindustan Times conference, where I was anchoring a session with her, it was the obvious question. Any fool, any child would have asked, what do you think of the nuclear deal? So we asked her that, and she said, we'll see, it's not that important, etc. Now, I had no idea, but according to Sanjay's book, and assuming he was also hiding under the table and watching, Manmohan Singh in his house was watching. In the house, the Prime Minister's house, number 3, is very different from number 7, which is the office area. So Manmohan Singh in number 3 was apparently watching my interaction with Sonia live. And when he heard that Sonia had said this, changed his mind. And that afternoon, I did a session with Manmohan Singh. and asked about the nuclear deal. He said, well, if it doesn't go through, the heavens will not fall. It's not the end of life. So far, so good. According to Sanjay, Manmohan Singh was very shocked when he saw Sonia see this and changed what he was going to say. How Sanjay knows this, I don't know. He wasn't with Manmohan Singh. He also says that the question I asked Sonia was pre-arranged, which is odd because, I mean, supposing you're interviewing Narendra Modi, wouldn't you ask about the Rafale deal? Wouldn't you ask about Ayodhya? It was like the big issue of the day. So it was the obvious question to have asked. There was no question of having anything pre-arranged. Also, Sonia was taking audience questions, and we couldn't have asked hundreds of people to only ask pre-arranged questions. On the other hand, Manmohan Singh, for instance, refused normally to take questions because he was so frightened of them. And after that, when I asked him that question on the nuclear deal, he never ever let me moderate a session with him at the Hindustan Times Summit again. The following year, he chose some guy he knew. And the next year, incredibly, he got Sanjay Baru to interview him because he was so frightened of questions from anyone else. So that, of course, Sanjay leaves out of the book.
But I mean, I'm assuming, I mean, side note, it's within his rights as a prime minister to choose who he wants to have on, like, ask questions. If
No, it's not. No, it's not.
It's
If
not?
you're prime minister and you
Yeah.
appear at a public forum, you
Right.
answer questions. I mean, Boris Johnson answers questions. Trump, who's a really nasty piece of work, is asked hostile questions at every White House briefing.
Right.
It's only in India if you're prime minister, you can say, I'll take this one, not this one. You're answerable to the people. You take questions, you answer them.
KV, you have any questions? You're looking like you have some. Your brain looks like it's throbbing with information.
No. I just as soon as Veer said, scene from West Wing started coming to my mind where they were so scared of going to the press room that people will ask questions.
Yeah.
And I don't want to talk about the current government, but this has been a shift, right? It's been a shift from the good old days of Vajpayee answering questions to Manmohan being slightly more cagey, and then now the current regime is like notorious for not talking to the press or like getting unscripted questions. I don't know if we can talk about the current government. I'm very scared to talk about the current government. I don't want to say anything.
You're the man who asked me questions about the emergency. I just want to put that on record.
Okay, I mean, now questions are we got to come back to politics, but let's take a break from that because I think there's a lot to cover in it. I think there is the other side of you is obviously like I remember watching the NDTV Good Time show where you went out and you're like, hey, I want to make perfume custom made and all the leather.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, it was great. Okay, so somebody is a fan of that, which is where's it gone? Yeah, Prathamesh Ganga Khedkar says, hi Sorabh, thanks for bringing Vir Sanghvi on board. I've been watching Mr. Sanghvi since the days of Custom Made with Vir. Please bring back such shows.
I'd love to bring it back, yeah. The problem was, I'll tell you what the problem is, that NDTV Good Times, which had just started, approached me and said that they wanted to do a food show. I said I wasn't interested in a food show because I was doing one with travel and living anyway. I was interested in a show that showed off Indian artisanry, that we were just then getting into this whole big designer thing. People thought everything had to be imported and designer. And we were forgetting that most of this stuff was an industrial good that was marketed and hyped out of all proportion. Whereas in India, you had guys who were making perfume, who were making cufflinks, who were making bandgalas. We did all kinds of things who never got the recognition they deserved. So I said, supposing we did a show focusing only on India and what India had to offer. And NDTV agreed, so we did the show. We did a second season. We done, I think, altogether about 11 episodes of the show between two seasons, 12 maybe. And oddly enough, it's my most popular show. It's the one people keep referring to. But you can't do it now because the way the economics of so-called lifestyle channels work is that either they buy very cheap Australian programming, programming that's 3 years old, that's been shown to death on other channels, or they do sponsored programming in India. Somebody would have to pay for them to do the show. If you're going to do a show on artisans and poor perfume makers, you're never going to get any sponsorship. So unfortunately, that kind of show is not possible on television. Maybe it'll be possible on the internet. I'll wait a year and see.
By the way, just a random thing. I stumbled upon your YouTube channel and I was actually like, I was fascinated why you stopped it because there was some interesting bits. I think it just like you started it probably prior to a lot of interest. Like I think you had a couple of videos about India and Pakistan and a bunch of others, which were actually quite interesting. So
Yeah, we still have it. It
yeah,
was actually it was not my idea.
uh,
It was started by somebody I know in respect. And then he also got involved in other things. I got involved in other things. But the channel still exists and maybe we'll revive it. But the idea then was not to do this kind of programming, but to do short clips of like 1 minute, 2 minutes, that maybe each week I would explain what was happening in politics, etc. So it's a good idea. At the moment, I'm kind of pressed, but once this lockdown and all that's over, I'll happily look at reinventing it.
so I've been tracking like for the last week, just like re-researching all. I mean, I know how much work you've done. There was the Good Times show, there was the editing, there was all that stuff. What I'm curious about is how does and there was some piece that came, I think, on News Laundry about how Hindustan Times is struggling. Is there any? I mean, let's just. I mean, all media houses are struggling right now. Everybody's
Yeah,
struggling. It's not specific to one company. But how are you guys dealing with this whole crisis right now?
I'm no longer part of Hindustan Times. I
Okay,
retired when I was 60. I'm a columnist for the Hindustan Times, but
right.
that's about it. So I have no idea what the financial situation is. But my guess would be they're struggling like everybody else, not just newspapers. I mean, every business is struggling at the moment. And newspapers are worse hit than anybody else. But generally, the number one paper and the number two paper usually manage in each city, which means the HT is okay in Bombay, it's okay in Delhi. It's closed down editions in many, many cities where it didn't have much of a presence, which I think is wise. I don't really see it struggling forever. I see a more slimline version of the HT surviving. And I see it surviving just to say the Post or the New York Times or anybody has. It won't be the big money making machine it used to be, but it'll survive. I don't see a problem.
Yeah.
Yes, KV.
Yeah, I wanted, since we've now moved away from politics for a while and talking about food,
Yeah.
sir, that's one aspect of yours that I mean, I'm a huge fan of, because I'm genuinely interested in food. And then what I wanted to know was, like, from what I've read, you took a break from, say, mid 80s to 2001, where you did not write about food, but you were always interested in food, and
Yeah.
that's when you resumed your writing about food when the Sunday supplement for Hindustan
That's
Times
correct.
started
Yeah.
coming.
Yeah.
And you still do
Yeah.
every Sunday,
Sunday. Yeah.
brunch has a root food column. Now, interestingly, food is also not that simple a topic to write about, especially in a country like ours, where
Right.
our culture and our history is very intertwined with food. You know, think about, where does rasgulla belong to? Where does biryani belong to? Who are the OGs of
Yeah.
biryani? Or, like, is sambar a Maratha
Yeah.
invention or a Tamil invention? There are just millions of debates in, even within the food industry slash the world of food.
Yeah.
How did you sort of like I just want to understand, like, the difference between you assessing, hardcore political things, like, for instance, the functioning of raw in
No.
Pakistan, and
Yeah.
how Gujarat dealt
Okay.
with it, and about controversial things like tomatoes were not in India for the longest of time. They came here with the
Yeah.
Portuguese, etc., etc.
Okay.
How do you deal with
I'll
this?
answer that, but you guys have been talking to me for an hour. So can I take a 2 minute loo break? I'll be back
Yes,
in a
yes,
second.
yes,
Yeah, you guys
absolutely.
talk
Yes.
to each other.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll just. So this
Read
is
the
very
super chat.
interesting, man. I'm so happy we're doing this. Yeah, and I'm saying
I'm
everybody in the
so
chat, please
happy.
ask whatever you want.
Yeah.
I think we need to
Yeah.
just like stop being so like ask
Yeah.
questions, man. By the way, I've
Yeah.
lost my
Yeah.
AC remote. I'm just going to find my AC remote. I'm going to come back in
Yes.
12 seconds. And my
Wow.
yeah, because
Okay.
I
Cool.
wore this transparent T-shirt, and now I realize
Huh.
it's made of wool. Do you want to take a 1 minute loo break also?
No, no, I'll be here. No stress.
Okay.
I'm
Okay,
free.
I'm coming in 3 seconds.
Yeah, yeah. I will try and see कि क्या चल रहा है इस life पे दोस्तों. Let's let's see. Sorabh Pant live now. Okay, cool. See random comments. Okay, let's do this. Vivek Sharma, thank you. And wow, where do I see the chats and everything? It's so awkward to see other people's YouTube channel. अपने चैनल में पता होता है कहाँ देखना होता है. शिवान says केवी गलती से कॉमेडी में आ गया, जर्नलिज्म में जाना था. शिवान, you are right. growing up in Delhi, my biggest dream was to become a journalist and to write columns for Hindustan Times. जब मैं 11th-12th में था, मेरा सपना होता था कि सेंट स्टीफेंस में किसी तरह एडमिशन हो जाए और मैं एक दिन जर्नलिस्ट बन जाऊं. But engineering happened. Okay, let's see what all you guys are saying. KVOP, thank you guys. Aman says KV North Campus my favorite eating place. Hey, कहाँ topic पहुँच गया? But let's have fun while the two of them are away. QD's QD's OG North Campus place. Okay, they are back, so I can now shut the.
Okay.
Okay, cool.
Sorry about
Saurabh,
that, yeah, but you know, journalists, we survive on leaks.
I took this opportunity to do exactly this, so I'm so relieved. I think we should have a 1 hour break in the middle.
I think so. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
no problem, Saurabh. I was reading
You
the
asked
chat
him a
and
food
answering
question.
questions.
Do you want me to answer that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Of course, I want you to answer.
What was I sort of interrupted you.
Yeah.
You've given the background. What did you really want to know?
I want to know two things basically. One is the difference as a columnist, as a political journalist, so to speak, and as a food columnist and food journalist.
You know, no difference because I started my career with India Today, which was a news magazine, and I think before I was 23, I'd done 5 cover stories for them. Some were political, some were films, some were whatever, right? So I taught myself then, it was sort of Time magazine training, because India Today was patterned on Time, which is that no matter what you write about, you bring the same attention to detail, the same amount of research, the same care to it. So I've always been, even when I was editor of Sunday, I wrote about everything. I've always been the kind of journalist who believes that if you're a journalist, you must bring the same attention to anything you write about. You can't say that if I'm going to interview, say, Vivek Oberoi, to choose your example, or I'm going to interview Narendra Modi, it should be different. Because at the end of the day, it's just an interview. So I brought the same sort of attention to my food columns as I did, and the same kind of commitment as I did to my political stuff. Often in my political stuff, I took stands that were at odds with what people believed. And I've done that in my food stuff also, like my theories on samosas, biryanis, etc., are at odds with what most people believe happened. And I enjoy that.
Saurabh, we can't hear you. You're on mute.
There's a very interesting question that's come for me, which is quite interesting. And
What is
I
the
love
question?
it's so basically we did a stream with about 10 comedians yesterday on Tuesday, and it was about 3 hours 17 minutes long, and then we cut it down because there was some stuff that in a live which you don't want to be there for perpetuity.
Okay.
And I love conspiracies. So this is a conspiracy. Praveen A asked, talking about freedom of speech, you have edited out OML criticism. OML is the company that manages both of us, Kumar and me, from the Delhi overtake video, and Manav is shamefully defending it. Are you okay with it? By the way, I just want to say there is no conspiracy. There is a lot of people involved in saying a lot of things, and sometimes after it gets done, they're like, "Hey, I didn't mean it to come out like that." So just like there is no conspiracy. We are. I don't. Here's the entire intention of this entire podcast is I want everybody to be comfortable and happy. And if somebody says something that this thing, I will happily remove it. It's not like I'm going to be like, oh, I will achieve success on your back. There's nothing like that. So the reason why it's been removed is because we live in a world right now where it could be taken out of context by somebody who doesn't know what's happening. And I'm sure Mr. Sanghvi will attest to people taking things out of context. So
So two things. First, call me Vir, not Mr. Sanghvi. Secondly, what's it like for you guys? Let me ask you this. What's it like being a comedian of any description, a stand-up or whatever, at a time when people don't just get easily offended, they're looking for reasons to take offense, where the principle that if something doesn't offend you, what's the point of freedom of speech, has been completely lost sight of, and freedom of speech is meant to be freedom that makes everyone happy. Is it difficult for you guys thinking of things?
I don't know. I think it's always been a variant of it. Like even like I started in 2008, and back then, I mean, you were making a lot of jokes about Manmohan Singh because it was like obviously you will make fun of, and by the way, you make fun of the prime minister not because you have an agenda, but because they're constantly in the news. You're making fun of stuff that is constantly in the news. So I just want to tell a lot of people who are out there going like, you have an agenda. I'm like, no, we just like there is a lot of news coverage because you are in power. but I do think there's a variant of it. I don't know if you guys agree with me, but I do think there is a lot of the bigger issue that I find is with regard to some of our laws that are really really stupid, and also with regards to our policing where threats are considered normal conversation.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I've spoken about this before, wherein this is this is my New Year's Eve celebration from 2017, 2018, 2019 was each year somehow or the other around New Year's Eve I got death threats each year because I
Really?
think because I think people are at home for that 7-8 day period and suddenly they're like, hey, we've discovered this guy's videos. So people are finding tweets that I put out in 2014 out of context and finding death threats and stuff like that. So I do think that there is it's also about law and it's also about the fact that we've started treating threats as normal, which it never should be the case. So yeah, I don't know what you think about it, KV.
Yeah, but I mean, the political stuff is okay. I mean, in India, we've always been sensitive. In America, Donald Trump has given the late night comedians and the hosts
Yeah.
a new lease of life. So attitude has been different. But now it's become you do this, you've upset such and such community. You do this, you upset such and such community's uncle. I mean, that's new. It was never that bad.
It's also because I think I am happy to apologize. By the way, I have no qualms with apologizing. Not because I'm scared. I mean, of course I'm scared. Fati padi rehti hai kahin baar because you have a family. But also, I don't want people to feel that way about what I put out. I just don't want you to feel so miserable. Like if it's something that's making you feel so bad about it, it's fine. But and this is the reason why I think like we've almost amalgamated the whole screaming on news debates with Hindustani bhav as a almost normal thing to do. And I just think that people should first give the option of telling somebody that, hey, listen, what you did is incorrect because of XYZ reason, and we believe that it's wrong because of XYZ reason before you start sending the death threats. I don't know when we lost that option of having to communicate to each other the fact that this might be something that you want to withdraw because of XYZ reason. Not straight away like we jump the gun from 1 to 100 and say, I would like to assassinate you if I
No,
have your
obviously.
permission. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
but I don't know. I think it's a variant of which has been bubbling for a while. I
Yeah.
yeah.
I actually blame the educational system because when you teach people about free speech at school, let alone college, you don't actually teach them that free speech is okay. You can say what you like as long as you don't physically harm anyone, incite violence, give away state secrets, or defame people. Apart from that, in most Western countries and most other democratic countries, that's pretty much the definition of free speech. To say in India, it's not free speech because you hurt my feelings is perfectly acceptable. It's not acceptable in any other democracy, which is
Yeah.
sad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I don't know who brought this up. I think this was post and by the way, I have a theory, which is that this happens every year and a half with stand up. Since I
Really.
started in 2008, every year and a half there's been some incident which has been the sort of flashpoint for something like this. Whether it's the roast, whether it's a Snapchat video, whether it's a news debate or whatever it is, there's always been one. Every 1.5 years it surfaces, and I do think there is a lot of like people who just don't like what we do as this thing, right? Like. And they just don't. And I love this thing where people say that, hey, stand up is a Western concept. And I'm like, I think you need to sort of do a little bit of research about India because we've had Hasya Kavi Sammelans for eons.
Yeah.
Gujarat had Gujarati theatre used to have that sit down, which was effectively a stand up thing about sex and politics and all that kind of stuff. And by the way, if you want to go past Western influences, then stop news debates.
Yeah.
I'm just saying it was never part of Indian this thing. So I just like this whole Western concept thing. And I think there's enough comedians for everybody to enjoy. There's
Right.
comedians who are clean, there's comedians who are dirty, the comedians. So pick your genre. You don't have to go out of your way to get offended. Like I do think a lot of people what they do is that they're like, hey, let's walk 19 kilometers, take a U-turn and peek over somebody's roof and see why they're offending me. So I'm like, just I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
But I agree with you. I think people are within their rights to feel offended, but also not within the rights to give with that. KV, you have no opinion on this?
No, I just want to say that like I haven't been in comedy as long as you have, but whatever limited time I've spent here, I've been very cautious. I mean, I've just played safe because for me it's all about peace of mind, and just one of these things will just, because one big example that I always give to my close friends is politics is my, like, one of my favorite topics, which I've, I can quote, you tell me year and I will tell you everything about that kind of, you, like, whenever even Veer sir is speaking, I'm like 89, okay, Chandrasekhar aa gaya hoga, nahi, okay, VP Singh, okay, cool, 91, yeah, Shri Paramudurga, May 20. So all that is happening here, but I haven't spoken a political line,
Uh,
sentence in my entire comedy career. I'm just like, meko dur. I can't do it. Maybe at some point, but right now I just want to talk about basic things like MBA and engineering, and hey, MBA life is so cool, and yeah, corporate life. I don't know. At some point maybe, but it's just not worth it. I'm just very particular about my family, my peace of mind, my parents, my loved ones. It's very scary what is happening to some of my colleagues. I can't
Yeah.
take it. I'm not strong enough to take it.
yeah.
It's very sad in a way because
Yeah,
it affects the quality of our democracy.
maybe yes.
Hmm. Has it ever happened to you where you've got? I mean, okay, we got. Okay, I'll just take a couple of questions, and I got to come
Yeah.
to this whole thing about what we've been talking about. Aditya 31081997. What a nice man. I like how you didn't even try to change it to your surname. I'm a big fan of Veer sir. I remember seeing him as a judge of a cooking show on NDTV Good Times, in which Indian chefs took on Pakistani chefs. So, can you tell me your all-time favorite food to eat? What is the show? Indian chefs versus Pakistani chefs sounds like a really fun idea.
It was a show in 2011, I think. It
Yeah,
was called Foodistan. It was one big budget show. They had like 10 or 11 Indian chefs with 10 or 11 Pakistani chefs, and they had one Pakistani judge, me, and one English judge to make it seem sort of unbiased. And basically, the Indians beat the shit out of the Pakistanis, which led to another controversy in Pakistan. But the difference, I think, is that Pakistani food is much more Punjabi, much more
Mhm.
rustic. It's the kind of food they've been making for years and years. In Pakistan, a variation of Rara Gosht will be considered haute cuisine. In India, our chefs consider that like basic and try and do different things, try
Yeah.
and make it lighter, make it different, etc., which the Pakistanis have no interest in. So one good thing that emerged out of that show was that Manish Mehrotra, who won it, then became
Yeah.
known as one of India's greatest chefs after that show. But it was interesting because people keep saying that we are the same people, we eat the same food. Well, judging by that show, no. I mean, the attitudes of the Indian chefs and Pakistani chefs were very different. And the
Yeah.
food was very different. Pakistanis had very different food.
but what is the
Yeah.
controversy? What did they say that they said that the judges were biased or something? Or what is it? What is the?
No, the controversy was that the Pakistani judge, I saw interviews because these guys went back and appeared on television shows in Pakistan. They took, it's like a cricket match, no? They took the defeat very
Yeah.
badly. So they had to give excuses. So one of their criticisms was that the Pakistani judge was married to a Hindu, which of course meant that the judge was not really a Pakistani any longer.
Wow.
That the English judge knew nothing about any kind of food, which may or may not have been true. And that while I seem to know about food, had never been to Pakistan, which is true. And therefore, I was not qualified to judge Pakistani food. But yeah, I mean, if it's a Sikh kebab, you don't have to travel all the way through Lahore to judge a
Yeah.
Sikh kebab. So it was difficult to explain to them.
Wow.
Everybody's just waiting for a controversy, right? In general,
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
just feels like, yeah, how dare you?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I want to, like, when
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah.
when that question came, I want to ask the question, but then I realized Veer sir has written so many articles about it. But I will still do it just for the
Okay.
sake of it. If you had to recommend, and I'm not talking about the fine dine cuisine and like the
Yeah.
5-star restaurants, budget restaurants in this country, top of your mind. Are there any names that you swear by as a foodie?
Yeah, a fair amount. Yeah, less in Delhi because now the dhabas in Delhi have all got a certain sameness to them. But in Bombay, which is a much more cosmopolitan city, you go to all the Konkani restaurants, you go to the Malwani restaurants, all of which are all the Gujarati restaurants. You go to even very clean and nice places like Som or Swati, which do chaat and
Yeah.
Gujarati food, which are
Yeah.
not expensive at all. The food there, on the whole, is much better than the expensive places. I find in Delhi, the sort of Punjabi dhaba thing has now become a certain blandness to it. All the recipes are the same, all the food is the same. But that may be because you're dealing with only one cuisine. Bombay has many, many options. Bangalore and Chennai, you go to the cheaper restaurants, that's where the good food is. The expensive restaurants are not that.
Yeah, MTR.
But I
MTR.
think this is
MTR, so you have to go for breakfast, which is already get up at 6 in the morning and go, which is okay to do once in your life, but after a while I stopped doing it.
Yeah.
But controversial
But you didn't
statements
mention.
here.
I'm sorry.
Controversial statements here. Vir Sanghvi has
Hang
said
on,
that
he's going to ask you a specific question.
Mumbai has
which I didn't
better
mention
food
what?
than Delhi, is what Vir Sanghvi has said. And this is a controversy. And I think everybody should go out there and tweet #justice for whichever cuisine you prefer. Sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah. No.
Hashtag down with butter chicken.
I had a very small doubt from what Veer sir was saying. You talked about Bombay, Delhi, Bangalore, and Chennai, but you also spent some years of your working life in 80s, I think, in Calcutta, and you did not mention it. Well,
Okay, so let's take Calcutta. I actually
what
now
is your opinion of Calcutta food? It's not as yeah.
No, I'm
sorry,
now
sir, continue.
doing a rating thing for food in India. So I've been traveling all over to unlikely places. Like I went to Bhopal, which none of us thinks is being a great center of haute cuisine. But the food in Bhopal is to die for. In many ways, it's even better than the food in Lucknow. In Calcutta, of course, there are all the great biryani places, all the great Muslim restaurants, and there's just no comparison. The puchkas, what we would call pani puri in Bombay and golgappas in Delhi, in Calcutta are easily the best in the world. So Calcutta, if you eat on the streets, you will get probably the best and most authentic street food in India outside of UP. I personally think you can have another controversy. Delhi street food on the whole is shit. Calcutta has the best stuff, and so does Lucknow. Many things in Bombay, like the bhel puri, etc., are real great inventions that are cosmopolitan. But in Calcutta, for instance, even if you don't want to eat jhal moodi and you don't want to eat the chana with chola, the chana with tikkis or whatever, you just have to go to somewhere like Nizam's and have a kati roll. Have a roll. I mean, that's one of the great inventions of Indian cuisine. And Calcutta never gets the credit it deserves for that. So I'm actually not that keen for Indian food. I'm not that keen on the really expensive restaurants. There are very few really expensive restaurants for Indian food that are any good.
Yeah.
But some of them are in Delhi.
We also like. Yeah. I know you talk about the two YTC restaurants a lot in your columns, Dam Pukhta and Bukhara. But the reason that's why, because I also believe, as like Sorabh would know, like the amount of travel that we do and the amount of local cuisines we taste, Calcutta is in my personal rating at the top, and that's why I wanted to interrupt and make you talk about Calcutta a bit, because it gets ignored.
But I lived in Calcutta. My wife was born and brought up in Calcutta, so we have a heavy Calcutta influence in our family.
Well, I'm a big fan of your wife's columns as well.
Same.
She's sitting here casting a wary eye at me, so I will tell her that.
Same. I saw her on a flight once, and I was like, oh my god! It's one of those moments where I was like, brunch she writes, and Veer sir also writes. One of those like very teenage girl fanboy moment.
I think all the like everyone who we are fans of is like it's not like I'm not like if I see Varun Dhawan, I'm like, hey, it's Varun Dhawan, that's nice. But if I see like a you or whatever, I'm like,
Thank you. Hardly in that league.
Okay, Rahul Mujumdar asks, I have always been in awe of Mr. Sanghvi's knowledge and diction. Please see, I couldn't even say diction properly. I said diction. This proves how bad I am at diction. Please ask about the journey for food. We've already asked that question. Okay, Sandeep Aditya has an interesting what if. What if Dr. YSR was alive? Do you think there is a conspiracy to his death? Had he been alive, would he have been one of the contenders in the central government?
I don't think so. I don't think he would necessarily have been a prime minister or whatever. But had he been alive, the fate of the Congress would have been very different. The whole basis of the parliamentary party in UPA 1 was Andhra. And I think the Congress really balls that up in the way in which they had handled Jagan after YSR's untimely death. So, I think history would have been different if he was alive. But I'm not that wild about the conspiracy theories. There are two kinds of people. There are people who have a conspiracy theory view of life, who believe that everything happens because somebody planned it, and people who have sort of fuck up view of life. And I tend towards the fuck up view of life. I think things just happen. It's not necessarily conspiracy.
Yeah.
We did touch upon this topic with our Ramchandra Guha podcast also, where we talked about the same thing, about how Congress bossed up the entire post-YSR state in
Yeah,
the
it
undivided
did.
Andhra Pradesh.
It
But
did.
I just want to add that Congress traditionally has not had, and one of the complaints that Congress fans have with Congress is in their history, they haven't really acknowledged the regional satraps as much at center. So you've never had a, like you've had the Kamarats and the A.R. Antules and to an extent even Sharad Pawars of Congress, but they've
Yeah,
been restricted to state politics, and so I don't think YSR would have been a player in Delhi, given the history
I
of
agree.
Congress.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I agree. And I mean, you mentioned Kamaraj, you will know that Indira Gandhi was installed as Prime Minister in
yeah,
1966 by a
yeah.
collection of regional satraps.
Syndicate.
And after
Yeah,
the syndicate, and after
yeah,
she broke free of them, I think the
yeah,
Gandhi family's policy has been
yeah.
not to encourage more regional satraps, which I think
Yes,
is a
yes.
shame. The Congress would do
Yeah,
well with
yeah, yeah.
more strong regional leaders.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The
Okay,
Gungi
Rohan
Gudia.
Veer Singh Dhaliwal asks, does Mr. Sanghvi think that just like the United States and other Western countries, the press will ever be able to fact check the Indian politicians? They
No,
do, right? No, you don't think so?
no, I don't.
Okay.
I don't think so. I think the American press is much more courageous than the press in any other country. I think they have been very fortunate that they've had employers who've backed them. You've seen the movie The Post about Watergate, now Catherine Graham backed
Yeah,
Woodward and Bernstein and Ben Bradley. I don't think that would happen in India. It happens to an extent, but on the whole, most of our proprietors will not back the journalists. And the journalists also, I mean, John Kenneth Galbraith, who was US ambassador to India in the 60s, wrote in his book about India that the Indian press is free but cooperative. And unfortunately, I think it still holds true.
Yeah, it's also the press. What is that press freedom index or safety or whatever? India still ranks relatively low for. Yeah, I mean, and you keep hearing on page 8, journalists killed, set on fire, like
Yeah.
every couple of weeks or something. It's quite a
Yeah.
scary time.
yeah. But to
Okay.
Saurabh, like we keep
Yeah.
reading about comparison of American politics, and great that Veer sir talked about Watergate.
Hmm.
There have been so many articles and analysis about. Just imagine what Watergate scandal is, okay, which led to one of the rarest moment in American history where a president had to resign.
Yeah.
Take that scandal, take that huge American 20th century biggest scandal, and put that in India, and it's just a minor piece of news
Yeah.
compared to our scandals. You know what I mean? Do you
Exactly.
imagine something like Watergate in India, where कुछ ऐसा कांग्रेस के होटल में ऐसा माइक मिल गया? Do you think it will lead to the prime minister's resignation? I don't think so. I
Because, I
don't
mean,
think.
what was Watergate scandal?
Yeah,
Thieves broke into the office of the Democratic National Committee. So in
yeah,
India, let's assume the thieves broke into the 24 Akbar Road or one of these party offices. Yeah. Two Metro reporters were put on the job. Instead of just writing little stories saying thieves apprehended or not apprehended, they thought there was more, and their editor backed them. They went ahead. Wouldn't
Yeah.
happen in India. And then the scandal unraveled, as we now know,
yeah,
because
yeah,
Deep Throat, who we now know was Mark Feld, who was
yeah,
part of the FBI, kept leaking stories to these guys till they got to the bottom of the scandal. Can you see somebody from the CBI, which is our equivalent,
yeah,
meeting two Metro reporters and leaking
yeah,
stories against the president, or in our case, the
yeah,
prime minister? It just wouldn't happen. It's not the Indian
yeah,
system.
But this leads to one of the things that happened a decade back, which I'm sure you've answered multiple times, which was the Radia papers.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's a very weird thing. I honestly never understood, even when it happened, about like journalists talk to political insiders all the time. I still don't understand what is the like the
But
two things.
actually, since we're
Yeah,
talking about it,
yeah,
just look at it in perspective.
yeah,
This lady was the PR for the Tatas and various other things. So, by definition, and later for the Ambanis, for Mukesh Ambani. So, by definition, she was talking to journalists all the time.
right,
Her phone was tapped by the income tax authorities on the basis of an anonymous letter which said, she's made money very quickly. And that apparently was enough to lead to taps on her phones. I mean, first of all, in terms of human rights and freedoms, that's an interesting question. Then people's phones are tapped all the time. Of the 10,000 conversations they had on file, something like 80 conversations were leaked. Not only were they leaked, whoever leaked them may have thoughtful enough to make transcripts of all of them, to put them in folders, a device like a file, audio file, with the conversations and the transcripts was then hand put in a brown paper envelope and sent to every newspaper virtually in Delhi. So obviously, somebody from the government had sold those tapes to somebody. That somebody presumably was rich enough to want to sabotage the Tatas or whoever, and had been able to transcribe them. Also cherry-picked out of thousands of conversations, just 1 or 2% of those conversations to leak. They picked conversations which they thought would cause the most impact. They were given to Indian newspapers, none of which bothered to even contact the people named on the tapes, or even to have the tapes tested. After this appeared, I took the tapes that involved me, and I had them tested in Washington and in London by guys who did audio testing for the FBI and for Scotland Yard. All of them said the tapes had been tampered with. I gave the reports to Outlook, which had carried the original tape, and Outlook ran the tape report saying that the tapes were faked, but would not apologize for carrying them. So I sued them. You know what it's like to sue anybody in India. It took 3 years, 4 years, at the end of which they withdrew the allegations. They said they regretted carrying them. But how many people follow this through? No? How many people bother to say, why was this taping done? Why were these tapes manufactured? Why was all this money spent on sending them to people? Who tampered with them? Who manipulated them? And why would a journalist just carry something which is clearly part of a corporate war without any kind of verification? I mean, there were very serious questions about A, the way in which our phones are tapped, B, the way in which officers sell these tapes, and C, the way in which we verify stories. What journalists said to her, etc., was ultimately the least of it, because most of that came from tapes that had been tampered with or manipulated. Most people just forgot this, they'll forget about it. Only I was bloody minded enough to get them tested, to go to court, to fight in the High Court, etc., and to get them to apologize. But most people just drop it because that's the Indian way. You just let things happen.
So 3 years is what it took.
Yeah, probably more actually. Because what happened was we filed a case after about a year when it was clear that Outlook was happy to carry things saying the tapes were fake, but was not going to withdraw the allegations. Then it went to a sessions court. Then the sessions court didn't want to hear the case. The very nice lady judge said, oh, there are too many high-profile people here. So it was then kicked up to the High Court. It took time to come in the High Court. Then, fortunately, you got a very good judge in the High Court who sent it back to a lower court and said, I want a verdict in a year. We had a very efficient judge. I don't think they had any defense at all, and ultimately their case collapsed.
So, but I mean, again, I know that it's obviously very dicey territory. I have a two-part question about this. One is that you said that it was somebody who did it. Obviously, there's no way to say the name. So let's actually ignore that question. The second question is, uh, I didn't follow the story entirely, like clearly. So maybe I'm completely off with this. But journalists talking to whatever political quote unquote insiders, isn't that a normal thing, or was that the assumption was that the allegation was that they said that journalists were influencing the cabinet, the formation of the cabinet.
No. I'll tell you that conversations happened after the election, after the second election, the UPA won.
Yeah.
Meera Radia was very close to the DMK, particularly to a lady called Kanimori, and wanted to know who would be in the cabinet. So she called up many journalists to ask for information on who would be in it. And journalists, of course, also doing stories, asked her, what does the DMK say, tell us, etc., etc. So there were these conversations because some of them were about cabinet formation. This was twisted to say that journalists were trying to arrange cabinet births. That was the allegation, which in my case at least, Outlook withdrew and apologized.
But what about the rest? The rest of the journalists didn't follow through with it, or it's just like,
you see, we don't know what the rest of the journalists did because she spoke to God knows. When the CBI got hold of the case, it interrogated some journalists. They found no criminality, but intriguingly, the journalists it interrogated were not the ones whose tapes had been published. So clearly, there were more people there, and I don't know what criminality they were investigating. But of course, ultimately, everybody was cleared. But she was very well connected. She knew everybody. I mean, if you are the one who is a gatekeeper for, say, Ratan Tata, I did an interview with Ratan Tata many, many years ago. She was the one who fixed it. She had PR for all the Tata companies. Obviously, you're going to deal with journalists. And even a concern about who was going to be the telecom minister was reflected in the Tata's interests.
Okay. KV, anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to, like, on this topic, a very small doubt about
Yeah.
the concept of lobbying. Okay, so in the US and all, lobbying is a very structured,
Yeah.
how do I put it? It's an occupation. There are professional lobbyists. There are people whose job is to lobby for a particular candidate to become a governor or a senator, etc., etc., etc. But in India, lobbying is still an informal thing and sort of like looked down upon, like something
Yeah.
shady. Do you think like there should be a more formalization of lobbying in the country, or you don't see uh, that being a possibility here?
No, I think it should be formalized. I think there should be laws. There
Yeah,
should be, like there are in the US, very strict guidelines. There should also be,
yeah,
like, we have a rule that defense agents are not allowed. The fact is,
correct.
anybody who sells arms uses an agent. So these people lie, they take their money abroad. So the more things you formalize, the more things you bring within the system, the more check you have about it, the more transparency, and the more control over the black money. In the case of defense agents, the money is paid in Swiss francs. Why shouldn't it be paid here? Let them pay tax on it. It's a legitimate activity. It happens all over the world.
Yeah, even I was very the reason for the story never, because I think by that time I'd watched enough American TV shows to realize that lobbying is a thing. So
Yeah.
I never understood why this is a conspiracy. Like, and
Yeah.
another thing which is a controversial opinion to have is about the Cobra Post sting operation, for example.
Yeah.
Like, as explosive as it was, I was like, is any of this surprising? Like, it just like, I mean, I know that it happens, and I think everybody in the whatever. But yeah, with this specific thing, I didn't understand why the lobbying was considered such a big this thing, big deal. Cool. Okay, let's take a few more questions. Sampath G asks, has India ever had freedom of speech? Is suppression of speech a new phenomenon? Very few countries in world have absolute freedom. I think as a traveling comedian, I can tell you that I think there's one country in the world that has absolute freedom of speech. And I don't want to name it because then people will start going like, you hate it's not that. It's just that every single country has, in the Middle East, you can't talk about people in power. In parts of Southeast Asia, you can't talk about people in power. In certain places, you can't talk about religion. In some places, you can't talk about food habits. It's just, I don't know. What do you guys think of this question?
My view on this is, I said that about the educational system, that almost from the time our country was founded, we've had unreasonable restrictions on freedom of speech. If you look at the books and movies that were banned in the 1950s, apart from the fact they banned Playboy magazine while everybody else was reading Pondi's and all kinds of hardcore porn, they banned Area of Darkness by V.S. Naipaul because they said it
Yeah.
was anti-Indian. There was this
Yeah.
book called Rama Retold by Aubrey Menon, which
Yeah.
was version of the Ramayana. They banned that. So we've had a very dishonorable record of banning works of literature, banning movies. I remember I was in Bombay in 74, I think it was. Jesus Christ Superstar, the hit
Yeah.
musical, which had been performed in Bombay, done by Alec Padamsee. A movie came there, admittedly not a very good movie, but the Catholic Church objected, and the movie was banned. So we were in the bizarre situation of being the only country in the world which banned a movie made by Christians about their Christian God, which we said, as a great secular nation, was offensive. Let's take the case of the Da Vinci Code, again a film made in the West, which was a big hit in the West. Nobody in the West thought it was anti-Christian. The Christian church objected over here and said the film should be banned. At that stage, Sharmila Tagore was head of the censor board, and she told them to go take a flying jump. They went then to Priyaranjan Das Munshi, who was the INB minister, who arranged a special screening and asked Sharmila Tagore if she could, adjust and be a little accommodating. She asked him to take a flying jump. And the movie was released in India without any cuts at all. So all you really need is guts. If people stand up for freedom of speech at this level, at the governmental level, you get somewhere. But unfortunately, it's now passed from government to mob. The real threat to freedom of speech doesn't come from the government. It comes from mobs. You make a movie where something offends some community, they'll come and they'll burn down the cinema. So obviously nobody's going to take that kind of risk. You say something offensive about somebody or what they consider offensive, a mob will come and beat you up. So the problem with freedom of speech is not, as we like to imagine, repressive governments. It's repressive citizens. That's our problem.
Yeah.
Even Satanic Verses, for example, was first banned in India before anywhere else. Ironically, in
Yeah.
Rushdi's birth country.
But that I had something to do with that since you're asking.
Yeah.
Uh,
Okay.
the book came Penguin India. I was editor of Sunday then, and
Yeah.
Penguin India was part of the ABP group, which owns Sunday, and it was sent to Khushwant Singh, who was then consulting editor. And Khushwant Singh said that the book is very offensive to Muslims, and Penguin India should not publish an Indian edition. My boss at the time, Avik Sarkar, who also owned ABP and therefore Penguin India, said, screw you, we are going to publish it anyhow. But I knew that this controversy was on. And so when our London correspondent went to interview Salman Rushdie, I asked her to ask him what he felt about the controversy. And Rushdie knew nothing about it. And he said very grandly, it's a funny view of the world to think that a book could cause riots. Ha, ha, ha. The interview appeared. Shahabuddin said, Shahabuddin, he was then an MP at that time, read it and called for a ban on the book. And I phoned him and I said, you've not even read the bloody thing. Eh? On what basis are you calling for a ban? He said, nahi, I've read the interview. It sounds like an offensive book. This demand that skyrocketed spiraled out of control among people who'd not read a single copy of the book, had no idea what it said. Various people got involved. The government of India responding, as it had done in the Shah Banu case, to pressure from the Muslim community and fearful of riots, immediately banned it. The ban was echoed in Pakistan, where a mob attacked the British Council office. Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran saw television and saw the attack on the British Council and said, what is this about? So somebody explained to him in Farsi that one man had written one very bad book and they were all complaining about that. He said, fine, issue a fatwa, let's kill it. And that is how the fatwa was issued by people who'd never even read the book. It's a scary story. No?
I think we will be expecting a tweet from Salman Rushdie shortly, where he's like, "I have found a man who started the entire domino effect."
It's
Signed by Joseph Stanton.
Think that a book could cause riots.
This is great. I genuinely didn't know this whole story. Okay. Lots of comments again coming in. Chinmay Sardesai says, "KV, don't be scared. हम आपके साथ हैं." ये तो पुराना वाला है. Big Dog says, "Yo yo 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 to you also." Okay, your thought. Okay, your thought on the Hindu paper 2024 election. I don't understand this question.
Nor do I.
Okay. Ashish Shashidhar Bharadwaj asks, who are both their favorite TV journalists now?
Who are my favorite TV journalists? Yeah. I never say anything good or bad about other journalists, because you say bad things, it's a bit incestuous. You say good things, you piss off all the others. So no comment on that one.
Yeah. But I had a similar question to ask Sorabh, to Vir sir. Since we were talking about fanboying, etc. And I'm not talking about the current TV journalists, but growing up, Vir, when you were in Mayo College as mayor, or then when you studied later in 70s, 80s, and we hear of, like, I have books from Kuldeep Nayyar and like Mark Tully and like the famous journalists from that, Khushwant Singh, for instance. Were there any people in Indian journalism or writing in general that you really looked up to, and you were like, maybe, are there any names or work? Yeah.
Kuldeep Nayyar certainly, he invented a style of political journalism that didn't exist before he came along. Mark Tully, not just because he took India to the world and did many, many good things for India, but because in an era when Doordarshan and Akashvani was censored or whatever, he brought the truth to any Indian who had a transistor radio, which is an enormous, enormous gift, the gift of free information. Arun Shuri, because he reinvented how newspapers were done. So I admire him greatly. T.N. Nayanan, who's still an editor, and I think is the best editor India's produced in the last 30 years or so. Mm-hmm. There must be more, but these are the ones who come to mind immediately.
Yeah. Kuldeep Nayyar's Scoop is a book I recommend to a lot of people, in the sense that it's a nice, like, small, like, thin book, but covers a very large portion of our politics. It's a great.
He's also very nice. He was also a very nice man. In the 80s, I went to see him for something, And he was just so helpful and so kind. And nobody bothered with the young journalists, not even sort of legends of the profession, so no chance. And throughout, he then kept in touch with me and was really encouraging and helpful. So I owe him a great deal.
I'm assuming this has happened a lot in your career. I mean, this is a side note, but it's like minor kindness from people, specifically when you're starting out, is always it always holds a crazy amount of weight as you go
Yeah,
on.
it does. Right? I mean, I always say that to people, particularly people who are busy or important, and say, why should we waste time on young people, etc. And I always say that because you were young and starting out once yourself, never forget that.
Okay, talking about conspiracies, we have another conspiracy in the house from Mr. Raghav Batra, who asks, Veer sir, first of all, I'm a huge fan, been following you from the days of NDTV Good Times. And this is the conspiracy. I hear from my elders that Mrs. Indira Gandhi was behind the death of her son Sanjay. What's your take? That's a
It's like a
pretty
serious question. Why would she want to kill her son?
yeah,
She loved him. She doted on him.
yeah,
And what did she do? I mean, he died as
yeah,
he had lived, recklessly and endangering the lives of innocent people. He was given a Pitts aircraft. He
yeah,
flew it in over Delhi
Yeah.
very dangerously. He crashed.
Yeah.
He crashed in Wellington Crescent, which is a
Yeah.
relatively well-populated area of governmental Delhi. We're just
Yeah.
lucky he didn't land on anybody, but he
yeah,
had only himself to
Yeah.
blame for his death. There was no evidence of any kind of foul play at all.
yeah. It's an easy
Yeah.
conspiracy to answer. It's not. It's not.
Yeah.
Okay. By the way,
This is from what we call as WhatsApp University, right?
That's true. Exactly.
yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
By the way, this is completely random. This is not a comment. When I announced yesterday that hey, you're coming on, I
Yeah.
got a message from a friend of mine who works at JW Marriott. I think he's in Goa or Delhi. I don't know which one. And his name is Atul, and he said, Mr. Veer Sanghvi, जब भी होटल में आते हैं यार ऐसी फटी हुई रहती है कि पूछो मत. He always reminds me of the character of the critic in Ratatouille.
Ratatouille. Yeah. Yeah. The parallel has been made, and the critic in that John Favreau movie, Chef, that
Yeah,
parallel has also been made. Yeah, but you know, it is a problem, and
yeah,
as a consequence, I don't do restaurant reviews. I
yeah,
don't write about restaurants because I do it very rarely, unless if it's very very good. But usually, I don't get the same experience as the average guest if I'm recognized. So
yeah.
therefore, it's unfair to judge restaurants. On the other hand, if I am recognized and I get a shit meal and I'm treated really badly, then the chances are that the average guest is going to get an even worse deal.
Yeah. Okay. Some people asking questions which have been asked before. Anshu Dipit, thanks a lot. He's a fan of your HT columns, and it helped develop a habit of reading. That's always
Same.
great. Dinesh KP, thanks a lot. We've answered your question in conversation. Samir Tyagi. Yeah, this is actually something that I've been wondering. They just announced a new education policy. So I didn't quite. People are celebrating. That's a good thing. I don't understand what it is about. What is your opinion on it?
I don't know much about the new education policy. I can't comment.
Okay.
If you're talking about the rewriting of history, obviously, I believe that all history must be rewritten to keep up with new discoveries and new knowledge that we've gathered. But history that's rewritten from an ideological standpoint, obviously, I oppose.
Yeah. Sorry, but the new
Yeah.
education policy that Samir, or I think
Yeah,
his
yeah.
name is Samir, is talking about is a thing that the government is doing. It's still being debated, uh, but the good thing is that finally they're trying to reform it after 34 years. I think
Finally.
Yeah.
it's the only thing that has happened after long. And there are of course a lot of discussion about cutting down syllabus, etc., etc. There is but good things like they're trying to standardize it by making a 4-year graduation
Yeah,
program
4
like
years.
they have in
Yeah.
the
So that's a good
West,
thing.
etc., etc. Yeah, so there are good, there are bad, still being debated. But the one good thing is that they're doing something.
Yeah.
Like the complaint that UPA 2 had for a long time was policy paralysis
Yeah.
in the media circle, right? So at least they're doing something. That's a start.
You know, one sign of like pride that I have is that my parents used to keep sending all these random WhatsApp messages which made no sense, like just random rumors,
Yeah.
and I would immediately Google search it and send it back to them saying it's a lie. So now at least what my parents have started doing is that they'll send a story and the copy pasted one, and under it they'll now also put a source.
Nice,
So
nice.
Okay, so
I'm
that's a
like,
good thing.
okay, this is at least like a verified story.
Oh
Uh,
yeah. That
Okay.
happens so much. Like someone who like has basic knowledge of Indian history. A
Yeah.
lot of these WhatsApp forwards, you look at it and you're like, dude, what is this? Like I'll tell you from yesterday morning, I got up and someone had written, like someone had forwarded this entire Somnath temple controversy of Nehru and Patel. And that I started reading it just for fun because I'm interested in it. And it says the president of India, Shankar Dayal Sharma, invited Nehru. And I was like, what? Excuse me. Oh my God. I'm like, I don't know how to react. Like Shankar Dayal Sharma became our president 30 years after Nehru died. You know, it's not even like one of those like, Neelam Sanjeev Reddy versus Rajendra Prasad confusion. It's not that. It's Shankar Dayal
But the,
Sharma and
pro-
Nehru.
but the problem is people believe this shit here. It comes
Yeah.
very
Absolutely.
difficult to argue with them.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, Chinmay Sardesai is here to help you, KV, and he's given $5 towards your legal defense fund. I don't know why we need it yet. Zishan Chaudhary has an interesting question, which is your views on the isolation and years of neglect by the government as well as the Indian media towards the northeast of India.
Yeah, I actually have quite strong views on the Northeast. I'm not so sure that the allegation of neglect and isolationism is necessarily accurate at the moment, because if you look at the budget allocations, the people of the Northeast get a lot more per capita than, say, the people of Bihar. We have tried to throw money at it in an effort to make up for what he correctly calls years of neglect and mistreatment. One of the problems there are two essential problems with the Northeast. The first is with their local politicians who are, I regret to say this, not necessarily the best advertisement for the Northeast. And the second is the prejudice many people, particularly in North India, have against people from the Northeast. We are reluctant to accept that they're as Indian as you and I. We treat them somehow as being different. And I think that is what causes the alienation. It's changed a lot. In the 1970s, I went out for several years with a girl from Mizoram, and every single person believed she was a foreigner. It was very hard to explain to people that there was a place called Mizoram, that these people were Indians, that they had a very rough time with the Indian government, that the only time the Indian Air Force has attacked Indian targets is when Indira Gandhi sent the Air Force to bomb the capital city of Mizoram. It's incredible when you think about it now, but that's the kind of trouble the people of the Northeast have suffered. If you look at it now, and I'm comparing it to those days, things have improved enormously. Are they right? Have we done enough? No, of course we haven't. But no, it's not as bad as it used to be.
Okay. That's okay. Okay, now this is a controversial question by Deep Jyoti Nath, who says Kolkata biryani or Hyderabad biryani. This is a this is this is more conspirational than the previous question about Indira Gandhi's hand and Sanjay Gandhi's hair. That's one of the weird questions to ask.
Well, it depends, no? When you say Hyderabad biryani, if
Yeah,
you go to most so-called famous restaurants in Hyderabad, and I did this 2 years ago, I went to 11 in one day.
yeah.
The quality of biryani has fallen drastically. The best biryanis are still made in people's homes. And at its peak, made properly, a Hyderabad biryani, ideally a kacha biryani, is really a thing of beauty and one of the best biryanis in India. The difference is in Calcutta, you can still go to restaurants in Park Circus or whatever and get wonderful, excellent biryanis. So if you're going to judge the best Hyderabad biryani against the best Calcutta biryani, maybe Hyderabad is a chance. If you're going to judge the average Hyderabad biryani against the average Calcutta biryani, Calcutta beats the shit out of Hyderabad.
So this is a mean mode and median version of the review of
Yeah.
biryani.
Yeah.
Okay, KV, you have any questions? I have one question which I wanted to ask. Do you have anything?
No.
Okay, I wanted to talk about this whole. I mean, and this is again something you did a 25-minute thing with Rahul Kanwal about Rahul Kanwal about Indrani Mukherjee and the involvement
Yeah.
in the 9X.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
I, by the way, have a completely random story about this. I had released a video ages back, which was a news piece about the Indrani Mukherjee thing when it happened. And as part of the thing, I had said that she's in charge of this thing called 9XM Media, which has this kind of programming. And I just put a 3-second clip of Bade Chote, which is an animated thing on 9XM.
Okay.
And it was the first time in 3 years of being on YouTube that I got a strike for my channel, which is basically like a copyright strike. And I'm like, what? For the 3 second, I got a copyright strike. Somehow I ended up getting in touch with the guy who basically put the strike to get the video removed. And he basically essentially told me, he's like, listen, my bosses have told me that they don't want any of this stuff out there. So this is just a means to end. And I'm like, whoa, that's pretty interesting. And then he was kind enough to allow me to re-edit the video without that bit. But anyway, so the Indrani Mukherjee thing, you were what is the entire story? I think you were
Okay, I'll explain it to you.
yeah,
I
yeah,
knew Peter Mukherjee well because
yeah,
Peter Mukherjee was head of Star TV. Peter Mukherjee then later started a network of his own, offered me a chance to head a news channel. It was a good opportunity. I'd never done it before. I took it, we hired people. Within a few months, they had launched their entertainment channel, and the entertainment channel was doing badly. And they started diverting money from the news channel to the entertainment channel, perfectly legally, I think, just to sort of keep the entertainment channel going, to spend money on distribution, etc. I said then that it didn't strike me as right. So we fell out quite messily. And at the end of the falling out, I think after just 10 months, I left the channel. And following that, I think either they left or were forced out, about 130 people or so. Nearly everybody who worked for the channel was forced out. The face of the person who forced that out was Indrani Mukherjee. Was she the main person who did it? Was it Peter's strategy? I don't know. I was out by then. But it was pretty much a terrifying experience for everybody involved. It's not one that I look back on with any kind of affection. The news channel then came out, it was crap with some new people. The entertainment channels continued to lose money. The Mukherjees then fought with the financiers, the equity guys who invested in it, went off to live in England in great luxury, seemingly unaffected by the failure of the channel. And I think that's what have happened if this case had not been filed against Indrani for murder. Given that that case is before the courts, I can't really talk much about it, but that's the story.
it's a very weird thing to me. I was trying to figure this out about like the aviation sector in India, for example, right? And it's the fact that effectively out of the whatever 12 airlines that we've had, three have been involved in some kind of uh, quote unquote questionable activities. Do you think that and this tends to happen a lot? I don't know if this happens as much as, and I mean, you obviously dodged a bullet with the whole, with that whole situation. Why do you think is it just generally like we've not changed our policies since we were attempting to be socialist to be not very pro business? Is there any case for that?
Yeah, it's partly that, but I mean, I remember the policies towards private airlines were changed by Madhav India.
Right,
He was civil aviation minister, and Indian Airlines pilots in those days used to regularly go on strike and hold the country to ransom. And he
right,
thought correctly that rather than just discipline the pilots, which had been the government's approach, create alternatives. So he unleashed all these private airlines, some of which the first round, most of them collapsed, but second round, some of them succeeded. But essentially, what's gone wrong with private airlines, what went wrong with private airlines, is that there was too much competition at the bottom end of the market. People entered into price wars. People got into ego battles about who was the biggest. For instance, Kingfisher was really finished when it bought Air Deccan because
yeah,
Vijay really didn't have the money to run it that way, and the company collapsed. Jet was finished when it bought Sahara so that it could be seen as the number one airline, and the company collapsed because it took on too much debt. One view is that most industries, when there are new industries and new entrepreneurs are entering, often people will make mistakes. They will overextend themselves. So I don't know if it's that much to do with the government. It is to do with the nature of the business abroad, like say British Airways, for instance. These are owned by private limited companies or public limited companies. In India, they're still owned by entrepreneurs. Nearly every airline is identified with one guy who actually owns it. And often entrepreneurs make mistakes, try and expand too quickly. The sector will corporatize, but it will take time.
yeah. It's actually quite a new sector when you think about it compared to the rest of the world. Okay, I think let's do two last questions, and then I
Okay.
think you've been very generous with your time. We really appreciate it. This has been a very interesting conversation. Like
Thank you.
I don't know about you, KV, but I'm always fascinated specifically by the history of Indian politics, because it shows you know what, like I didn't know this, because again KV knows way more stuff and you don't know more than all of us. Like after watching the interview with Mr. Vadia, is when I realized that we're a really young country, because the he's the grandson of Jinnah,
Yeah.
which just shows like you know you're a very young country when your
Yeah.
neighboring country's founder is essentially the
Yeah.
it's like, how long has it been?
Yeah,
um
I thought about it when Vir said that the Pakistani judge on Foodistan was married to a Hindu. The first thought in my mind was your father of nation was married to a
That's
Parsi.
not
So
not a Parsi.
don't
Yes,
talk
exactly.
about marrying non-Muslims here.
Okay, a lot of people are giving appreciation. I'll just read their names because there's a lot. Thank you, Anirudh Agnihotri. Thank you, Shashank Tiwari. Thank you, Rohit Rawat. Thank you, New Rider. Thank you, Rohan Veer Singh Dhaliwal. And thanks a lot to Jagdish Tirumalasetti and Alap Pandey as well. And thank you to Sania Khade, and thank you, Aditya, again, who's back. Okay. I wanted to know, you've interacted with so many Indian prime ministers and chief ministers and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Who do you who was the most striking to you? Like who was the one where you were like, this is uh, a very unusual, and I know that most of them are unusual, and it's a slightly weird question, but I'm just trying to basically weasel out some more stories from you. That's the
Okay.
scam I'm trying to run.
We'll do them in
Yeah.
order.
Yeah,
Rajiv Gandhi was actually the nicest.
right,
VP Singh, who succeeded him, was the slimiest.
right,
Chandrasekhar was the most sort of back to basics kind of guy who I liked enormously because there was no bullshit about him. Chandrasekhar was succeeded by Narasimha Rao, who was the most cunning and the least decisive. Narasimha Rao was succeeded by Vajpayee for 13 days,
13
but
days.
by Deve Gowda, who I had known already when he was Chief Minister of Karnataka, who wasn't as much of an idiot as people make out in
Yeah.
the retelling, but he was, I don't think, a particularly impressive character.
Yeah.
Deve Gowda was succeeded by Inder Gujral, who I had known when he was Foreign Minister, who was an amazing story because he was a Punjabi refugee from partition days who came over with nothing and was a completely self-made man. And I thought it was important that that kind of prime minister showed India that it was possible to make it. Very urbane, very nice man. Did not have the backing to do anything of any consequence. Gujral was followed by Vajpayee, who I actually liked the most, who I thought was really a great leader, enormously charismatic, very decent man. And him, I would probably rate as number one. Vajpayee was followed by Manmohan Singh, who started really well. Brilliant man, things. But I think around the time of the nuclear deal and all this nonsense about Singh is king, it kind of went to his head. When the scam started, when he realized he couldn't cope, the Anna Hazare movement, he retreated into a shell, and you had what KB referred to as policy paralysis. He created an enormous leadership vacuum, and that was filled by Narendra Modi, who, of course, is our current prime minister. I think I've covered all the ones I know.
yeah. That's
Yeah. Yeah.
IK Gujral was an interesting one to me, because, but okay, you
Yeah.
said VP Singh was the slimiest. In what way?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
he was just like he said something and
He
did
was
something. Or...
cunning, insincere, would lie straight faced, that kind of thing.
Okay.
I mean, you could argue that it's pretty much a job description for a prime minister, but
Yeah.
he also had that image of being this very fakir. His slogan was
Yeah.
Raja Nahi Fakir Hai. People
Uh-huh.
used to hate him, but
Yeah.
he was also a man without any core beliefs. When things started going wrong, he introduced the Mandal Commission recommendations, which he'd never once spoken about or done anything, only to build an electoral base for himself, created a huge amount of social tension, but didn't care.
Yeah. Yeah. Because in terms of brand also, like we used to study in MBA,
So,
he's like when he was in Rajiv's government, he sort of made his brand that I am
yeah,
anti, like I'm a very clean guy, and this
yeah,
the clean Gandhi is not really clean. And And then, but he was a Raja technically because he was a Raja. And so he started this new brand slogan of Raja Nahi Fakir. Hey, I'm not a Raja, dude. I don't have money. मैं तो common आदमी हूँ. मैं तो ये लोग बड़े लोग हैं, Rajiv Gandhi वगैरह. And इनका मैं तो clean हूँ. And I'm the one as a finance minister and as a defense minister who is going after them, going after Kothrochi, going after Bofors and all that. So he was a very cunning like marketeer also in terms of his brand positioning. Yeah.
And the irony is that everybody around him and his staff who knew him called him Raja Sahab. So he was hardly one humble man of the people. But that was, as you say, the marketing.
Yeah.
There's a story, and you said Vajpayee was your favorite. There's a story about Vajpayee, which I don't know whether it is in Sanjay Baru's book or somebody. I think probably in Half Lion, about how I think Vajpayee had said something in the parliament against Manmohan Singh, and Manmohan Singh was like, "This is too much," and he decided to quit. And then Vajpayee had to call him up and say, "No, this is the parliament. This is how it happens. You don't have to quit over me." Was there's a real story, or
it sounds like a real story? I think Manmohan Singh quit once when he was head of the planning commission during the Rajiv Gandhi time also, because Rajiv said something about the planning commission. He resigned thrice when he was finance minister because people said things against him. But I mean, it's like people's suicide. No, there are genuine suicide attempts and there are calling attention to yourself suicide attempts. I suspect all the resignations were call attention to yourself resignations, because when things went really wrong in UPA2, when he should have resigned and let somebody else take over, he clung on to his chair and wouldn't go. So he's an interesting guy that way.
Yeah, so UPA won. I mean, and this is like, I think there was that period when first was Vajpayee, and then there was Manmohan Singh. There was a period where it was like largely focusing on development and economy and all the rest of that stuff. But with do you think Manmohan Singh was not allowed to resign? Like there was nobody to replace him, or why did he cling on? Because his first
He
term
loved the job, that's why he clung on.
Right.
The only way he would have left is if they would have dragged him out of Racecourse Road, kicking and screaming, still holding on to his chair. He made it very clear in UPA2 he was not going. He didn't expect the job because, as I said earlier, he thought the left would object and Pranab would get the job. Once he got it, he thought that the victory was entirely due to him and he wasn't going to leave. There was a time halfway through, after this Anna Hazare stuff started, etc., when it was clear he wasn't going to make speeches, wasn't going to take decisions. Things had gone very wrong. He depended on Sonia Gandhi to look after the party. She was ill. She went off for treatment. I think Pranab Mukherjee was just sort of waiting to step in, but Manmohan wouldn't let him do it.
So what is it about Vajpayee that like everybody is usually very effusive in praise for him? And I mean, you can sense with his speeches that including Narendra Modi's, there's not been anybody more impactful. Like even that angry speech that he made when they pulled the government. I mean, that's still probably one of the most seminal pieces of. But what else about him? Was it because he was cordial and he accepted people?
He wasn't cordial. He wasn't cordial. If you went to meet him, for every 40 words you said, he would say one. He was a very hard man to make conversation with. He said very little. When he spoke, he had huge pauses. He was not a prime minister for our times because his pauses in his sentence were longer than the commercial breaks on most TV shows. You would often talk to him, he would say something, and then you would think he'd finished, and you would say something, at which stage he would resume his sentence, and you had to shut up. So he wasn't actually that kind of fun guy to talk to, but his intentions were always noble. He had a sense of statesmanship. He rose above pettiness. And he actually believed in a vision of an inclusive India, despite being part of the BJP. He had a very difficult time. The RSS didn't like him. He was heading a minority government. Advani didn't like him, so there was constant tussle between him and his deputy. But he never let it show. The world at large, he seemed like this relaxed statesman.
Okay, this is the last question that I'll ask. KV, do you have anything? I just have one last question. Okay, I wanted to know about this whole Sonia and Congress thing right now. And it's a debate that's been going on for literally the last 12 years now, which is the future of the Congress party. And about trying to figure out where a lot of people say that if the Gandhis leave the helm as probably they should, it's going to be fragmented and all the rest of that stuff. What do you think is like the future of? Oh, what happened?
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. What do you think? And I mean, even if it's not with Congress, what do you think is the future of Indian opposition? Like in general, is the Congress savable, if that's a word, or is somebody else going to step in?
I think the Congress is savable. The problem with the Congress is that whatever strategy Rahul Gandhi has followed, and there's no doubt he's followed it sincerely, and contrary to the image people have, he's not an idiot. I've met him, I've spoken to him. He's an extremely well-read person. But somehow the strategies he's followed have not been accepted for the country. To lose, to paraphrase Oscar Wilde, to lose one election is a tragedy, but to lose two elections so badly begins to look like carelessness. When you've lost two elections so badly, when it's clear that you cannot lead the party to any kind of success, when you yourself have said this and have resigned and said no member of my family will take over, then go off to do Vipassana meditation or whatever. Let the future take its own course. Instead, the Congress has no authority. There is no president. He's still around. He is an extra constitutional authority as far as the Congress is concerned, because he's not party president. He stepped down. Yet he acts like he still runs the Congress. His mother is interim president. It's a job she never wanted. So the whole thing is a mess. What should have happened is Rahul's resignation should have been followed by party elections. If Rahul believed he wanted to hang around, he should have stood for those elections. Maybe he would have won. I guess he would have won again. But at least there would have been some pretense, some show of democracy, some show of giving people a say. You can't just hang on. BJP narrative is that the Gandhis are this family that clings on to power and believes it has a divine right to rule India. By their actions, the Gandhis are playing into this narrative, and they don't have to. There were alternatives, and they haven't taken them.
Awesome. This has been a very fun conversation. Thank you so much,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Sangvi. Mr. Sangvi, I will call you Vir now. Haha,
Yeah,
I've been
please call me Vir.
upgraded.
Please call me Vir. Yeah. Thanks, guys.
This has been really, really interesting, and I really enjoyed it. And again, as KV already said, I enjoyed your interviews. I think oddly enough, the reason why I've always had you at the back of my head was somebody mentioned in the comments at one of the after the Guha one, where they're like, this reminds me of Cover Story by Vir Sanghvi, and I'm like, you know what, that was the chat show that I loved. Like it was not the rest of the Fufa. It was that show which I really liked. So
Thank you.
awesome. Yeah.
Thanks, Sorabh. This has really been fun. It's long, but I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it goes beyond human decency, where I just
Well, at least you let me take a loo break, which made it okay.
anything you'd like to say in closing? Anything you'd like to?
No, I think we've covered it all. It's just been so much fun. I'm just astonished by KV's knowledge of Indian politics. I mean,
No.
I've rarely met somebody as knowledgeable as he is, and you obviously have been a great interview. So it's been fun.
Wow.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time.
Whenever Sorabh was asking me if you have more questions, I have a million questions. And that's why I'm like, no, I have to stop. He has been kind enough to give us 2 hours. No, let me not go there. No. Because every year there's a question. Since
we'll do one again. We'll do one again.
For sure. It will be our pleasure and our honor.
That is a promise for the future. Thank you so much. Thank you.
That's a privilege and an honor. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. I'm just going to say goodbye, so you guys can just put off your audio and video. I'll just say goodbyes for the next couple of shows. Thank you so much. All right, guys, thanks a lot for tuning in. Really appreciate it. As I said, Friday is a break. Saturday we have Karunesh Talwar, Kunal Kamra, and Anubhav Pal, all three together. It's going to be really, really fun. Tuesday, Sunday, I've not figured out the lineup yet. I will announce it shortly. Monday again is a break. We're following Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, Sunday format just for sanity's sake. Tuesday, we have the XNG boys, which is Varun Thakur, Neville Shah, Adar Malik, and Kautuk Srivastav. So that's going to be fun as well. I hope to see you guys then. And also, please come see my shows. I have shows coming up. I have a workshop coming up. 31st, I'm doing a show for the Middle East with Oman is Laughing, which is largely targeted at people in Muscat and in the Middle East. There's also a talk that I'm doing for writing a book as part of the Coalition Festival, which is called, I've forgotten the name. It's something about writing, just whatever. And then first I'm doing a show as well, which is, I think, Rant of the Pant. And second, I'm doing Traveling Pants 2020. Both are content that you've probably never seen before, unless you've seen the specific shows. Tickets are on sorabpant.com. And once again, thanks a lot to everybody on Super Chat. If you'd like to support this podcast and keep it going, InstaMojo and PayPal, the links will be coming up shortly. Put it up there. And dude, thanks a lot to everybody on Super Chat. I know I can't take all your questions, but it'll go on for 4 hours then. But I appreciate all of that. And thanks to Manav and Niharika and everybody else. Really appreciate it. I'll see you guys on Saturday with Kamra, Karunesh, and Anubhav. It's going to be fun, guys. Thanks a lot. And by the way, thanks to Vir Sanghvi and Kumar Varun. I love Kumar Varun on anything that I do because he's just like every time I'm lost, Kumar is like, hey, what about 1963 when China invented this dragon, which was, and some stuff he comes out with. So it's always great. So thanks to both of them for being here. I really appreciate it. Follow Kumar Varun everywhere. Go and buy Vir Sanghvi's books. There are a bunch of them. Check out his old stuff. There's lots of stuff out there. Thank you so much, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys on Saturday. Goodbye.